Okay. Okay, so it looks like we're recording. Okay, so a couple things I wanted to get to. I know that a lot of you are pretty much done with a lot of the material in this course, and so that's good. If you have additional work you like to do or extra quizzes you like, or quizzes you like to go back and work, you can feel free to do that. One thing that I'm doing, and I know that we've had problems with grades and appearance of grades in Brightspace, and I believe I have spent hours and hours and hours working on this. And in fact, I've got a training seminar in the morning, and I've got a list of things I'm going to bring up with our distance learning people about some of the issues that we've had in Brightspace. I do want to tell you that I've gotten a number of emails from people about, hey, this grade didn't show up, including like some quiz and exam grades that didn't show up at all. And I'll just tell you that I'm seeing everything. I'm seeing all the grades, and I know that's probably cold comfort. It's not enough for me to see it. I know you need to see it as well. So I'm trying to work through some of these things, but to this point, it doesn't look like anybody has done something and it's not there. In other words, it's gone off into the ether. Now, the last couple of days, I've heard from a couple of people about missing discussion posts. In one case, I know I actually saw what was not apparent to the maker of the posts, and so I can't explain that. It seems like every day there's something new with Brightspace, and I know that we're still. I know that the school is making some changes and tweaks to it. And I think that might be part of it, and it's you know I know that you're about to graduate. So it probably makes no difference to you that we're going to try to get to the bottom of this, but there are a lot of things to look at. So what I'm doing is I basically went through every single quiz and exam and every single attempt on quizzes, and that's not a small task. And some people do quizzes like 40 times, which I'm going to go through all of those, and it's fun. I mean, I'll do it. It's just taking me a bit of time to do. I'd actually done that back when I wasn't even aware that quiz 1 and quiz 2 in particular were showing up as duplicate links, but I'm doing it again just so that anybody who took it after that, I can at least make sure that we've got the right grade reflected in Brightspace. What I am planning to do, because I know that next week is the last week of the course, you've actually got until until the 12th to do the second exam and to do whatever else is required, discussions for next week, etc. If you haven't already, but I should probably have most of the grades tabulated, with the exception of that final discussion week, which I'll do probably first thing Monday morning. And so if it gets to, I don't know, say fairly late in the week, like Friday, Saturday next week, and you're still not seeing grades, just feel free to give me a call or email me, and we can arrange a phone call or whatever, and we'll go through every single assessment line by line, just to make sure that we've got the same thing. And I know I've gotten a lot of emails in the last couple of days, and it turns out that other sections are having the same difficulty, and I've had to talk to other instructors who are having similar difficulties. Not all instructors are having difficulties. Some are. I don't know what it is. I know I'm not doing anything differently. I know I've used Brightspace for a while. This is like our 4th semester. So anyway, if you had written me, emailed me the last say 24 hours, I've probably not yet replied. I will be getting to you. Just I want everybody to be aware also that this is the time of the semester when I do get a ginormous amount of emails. So it does take me a bit longer, but I will get back to you. If I don't get back to you for whatever reason, just shoot me another email or call me. Feel free to call me. It's not a problem, and we can talk through whatever the issues are. So I'm not so busy that I can't, whenever take time to talk to you. I'm happy to do that. I'm just trying to figure out what some of the issues are, and we've had some other problems with Brightspace come up, and it seems like there are new ones all the time. But I'm confident. I'm very confident that whatever score that you earn will be what's reflected in the final grade. I'm very confident of that. So that's why I'm going through every one of these and posting and making adjustments where necessary. So be on the lookout for those. If you still don't see them at any time, just get with me, and I'll be happy to get with you. Okay. So any questions for me about that? I hate to keep talking about that, and believe me, it's not my favorite subject. This idea of I was telling somebody today, I've been teaching 20 years online, and I've never had this sort of difficulty with just weird stuff. So this is a strange situation. So okay, so bear with me, get with me individually if you like, and I'm more than glad to go through everything with you, and just to make sure that we're on the same page and we agree as to what's happening. Okay, Also keep in mind too that I do the lowest discussion grades dropped, so that'll be coming out of the picture as well. So just make sure. And I don't usually do that until I get ready to report the grades, and so you won't see that until Monday, week from Monday. That's when I'll be reporting for the semester. Even though you guys have graduation next Friday. And is that I can't remember, is that going to be virtual or is that going to be in person this time? Does anybody know about that?
It's going to be virtual.
It's going to be virtual. I know last time it was virtual, last time before that. So those are usually fun events when they're in person. Unfortunately, we're still virtual. So anyway, strange situation. So, okay. So I had posted in my weekly announcement on Monday another link to YouTube. And so I've posted two, well, I think there was about 2 hours that I posted on of worth of material. They would have covered some of the content from week 4, then everything from week 5. And so we are totally current with all the material in the class. We've got a fairly robust amount of activity to do tonight, but then not very much to do next week. And so if there's something that we don't get to tonight, it's an easy matter to pick it up next time without any problem at all. But we're going to be talking about monetary policy tonight, and then some of the things that we're just picking up some loose threads in terms of some of the model building that we've been doing, where we talked about the long run aggregate supply curve and didn't really describe why it was vertical, but we'll get to that tonight. We'll also talk about some different means by which we can explain inflation, and we'll get to that. But before we do that, we'll get to monetary policy and talk about what that's about. And it is the second part of what we call stabilization policy, that is government action in order to achieve what the government chooses to have as what's called a dual mandate. Usually the dual mandate is thought to apply to the Federal Reserve, but the same can be said for Congress and the president as well in their actions as fiscal policymakers, in addition to the Federal Reserve in its role as policymakers, the dual mandate being maximum employment, maximum price stability. Sometimes those are not easy to reconcile with each other. And right now, I think we're definitely seeing the difficulty in reconciling that. I know I've talked for the last few sessions about some of the inflation that we're seeing that nobody has seen for years, decades, really. And we'll find out next Friday, the 10th, what the inflation numbers will be for October, or I'm sorry, for November. It's always a week past. We get unemployment numbers tomorrow. We get inflation numbers on a week from tomorrow. And we'll see whether or not this is moderating, because the Federal Reserve Chairman just this week dropped the term transitory meaning temporary, to describe inflation. He and the Treasury Secretary both have been saying, well, this inflation is going to go away once we get the kinks in the supply chain worked out. All the labor shortages, and get people back to work, and get trucks moving, and people back in the office, and and all that. And with the end of some of the stimulus, like some of the extra amounts being paid to unemployment and all that, some of that's now is being spent and going away. We'll see whether or not that's the case a week from now, and let's hope that inflation has been coming down. If not, then I think we're going to definitely see some changes to monetary policy beginning probably next year, and that's just the way it's going to be. But before we do that, I just want to finish up just a bit and pick up from where we left off a bit last time when we talked about the Federal Reserve. By the way, when I talked in and by the way, I thought it was on YouTube. I thought it'd be easier to access. I think YouTube's a little bit easier to get to from like cell phones and tablets and whatnot. That's been my experience. And plus, I've got a YouTube channel, and it's easy to work with, and that type of thing. And I think we've also got a limit as to how much we can store each instructor on Zoom. So what I didn't want to do was run out of storage when I was recording that. So have a look at that. But in that last video, I talked a bit about the Federal Reserve and what it was doing, what the structure of it was, what it was tasked to do. That is to control the money, control the business cycle, to take the ups and downs away from the business cycle. That is, if you think of the business cycle as looking something like this, that the goal of monetary policy would try to smooth out and have lower highs and higher lows, to try to smooth it like that, given there's going to be some fluctuation, but not the up-down, boom-bust cycle that so often has characterized U.S. economic performance in the past. And I think that there is something that the Fed can hang its hat on and toot its horn to suggest that it has been relatively successful in doing that, as we've had relatively stable growth for many decades and almost no inflation, imperceptible amounts of inflation. I know the Federal Reserve in the last few years has been looking at a 2% inflation target, not 0%. I know that sometimes people say, well, why have any inflation at all? And I think the explanation for that, and I don't know if we talked about this in this class, was one of the explanations was it's kind of analogous to driving in a car. And that is, if you're driving at the speed limit, maybe you're not getting the most out of your road trip as you could. The speed limit is 65, maybe you can step it up to 70, and you're not taking your life in your hands any more than what you would be at 65, but you'll get there a little bit quicker, and it's getting the most out of the performance of the vehicle, that sort of thing. That's sort of the metaphor. So pushing the envelope a little bit, and it's interesting too, because we had a former Federal Reserve chairman named Paul Volcker who was really against inflation and despised it, and said that inflation was cheating. And I guess it's sort of just like maybe driving 70 in a 65 is sort of cheating, but it's sort of not. It's sort of okay. And I think that's what 2% inflation as a target should be. Now, having said that, since the financial crisis began in 2008, it's been very difficult to get to 2%, to get to that between 65 and 70 speed limit. It's only been in the last year, really, that we've had inflation above that. And a lot of that is thought to be mostly supply side driven. And I'm going to get to that a bit later and talk about what that looks like from the modeling standpoint, the macro modeling on the PY plane. It's what we call cost push inflation. And we'll see whether it's transitory or not through time. I think I told this class I'm not as confident as the Treasury Secretary has been. And I guess who am I to second guess? But we'll see. We'll see what happens. So anyway, when we talked about sort of kicking off the introduction to monetary policy, we talked about the uses of money, and we defined money as being fiat currency, and that is it's issued by nation states, or by groups of them in the case of the euro, and there are about 17 or 19 countries that belong to the Eurozone, but it's a monopoly of creation of a government only. That's what's called fiat. And by fiat, we mean it's not backed by anything in terms of precious metals. In other words, the value of money is not backed by anything else. And you can't redeem it for anything else but goods and services. There's no metals backing it. That's not always been the case. We started out in this country with a gold-backed dollar. I think it was actually backed by gold and silver, and it was mostly gold. Then during the Civil War, we went off the gold standard altogether, went back on it later in that century, and went off it again. And in fact, at one point, we went back on during the Depression. It was illegal for ordinary Americans to have gold, to actually own gold, except for incidental like gold fillings and whatnot. But to actually own gold was illegal for quite some time, until we went off the gold standard and then de-linked that in 1971 from the money supply. So we said that there are three uses of this fiat currency. That is medium of exchange, store value, and unit of account. We said medium of exchange is basically to overcome the barter problem. That is, if I want to buy a good and I don't have any money to do it, I have to find somebody who wants what I've got, who coincidentally has what I want who has what I want, and I've got what they want, which is a sort of a double coincidence of once that is taken away, because now all I have to do is find the thing I want and I pay with money, which is universally accepted. So medium of exchange, also store value, which is basically save money as money. And I know sometimes people get a little bit confused when they talk about money as a store value, because people will occasionally say things like, okay, stocks, bonds, things like that. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about money as money. That money can be either spent or saved. And so this is where we come back to linking it back to the money supply, which we will simply call S sub M. And that money to be used as medium of exchange is this M1 portion of the money supply. And when you hear the word money supply, we'll be getting a bit more into this in a bit. It's sometimes called the stock of money, the money stock, the money supply. It's basically these two elements that we got into last time. M1, which is the most liquid component, composed of cash, coin, money in checking accounts, traveler's checks, things like that, money orders. Those are easily spendable. In other words, in terms of liquidity being defined, as you know, as the degree to which anything can be converted to cash. It's pretty much already cash, and so it can be spent very, very quickly. M2, which serves more as the store of values, is all of M1. So we probably, more accurately, we probably should say M2 with the exception of M1. But M2 is dominated by the non-M1 portion. If you there's a pie chart and back in chapter 13 that sort of broke that out to show that difference there between M2 and the non-M1 portion of M2. So it works as a store of value. Then the third was unit of account, which is really both of these. We say that something is worth, like if you earn $10 per hour, you say I make $10 per hour. You don't say I make 14 or 8 Big Macs or whatever. Actually, I think 8 Big Macs is probably a lot more than $10 or 3 Big Macs, whatever the case might be. We don't denominate things in terms of other things. We denominate them in terms of money, and this is everywhere throughout the economy, as we know. So this is an important thing to know about. That is the uses of money translated to how we store money and use it. And then we want to introduce something new, and that's the demand for money. And here I want to explain what we're talking about here. We talk about the demand for money because I know that to the ordinary person, somebody might be tempted to say, what do you mean the demand for money? Hello? Yep. Oh. Somebody, I don't know if somebody had a question there. But it might be tempting for somebody to say the demand for money is infinite, that I want demand for money, that I could never have enough money, all that. I think we've all sort of heard that sort of conversation before. But what we're saying is that might be more applicable to someone saying that they have an unlimited demand for wealth, maybe. That may be what they're really talking about, because we're talking about money as money here. Money is money, money as money, not money as wealth like real estate or artwork or fancy cars or something like that. Now, why wouldn't someone's demand be infinite for money? It's because there are other uses for money, including other stores of value, such as stocks and bonds. And we'll particularly talk about bonds here very shortly as a means by which people use money and keep it fairly liquid. Bonds are generally fairly liquid. The only ones that are sort of not are the ones that are very unmarketable, or savings bonds are not particularly liquid. U.S. savings bonds. I'm not even sure anybody buys savings bonds anymore, but I guess they're mostly used as gifts at this time. So we're talking about money as money, and the two elements of this are transactions demand and asset demand. Transactions demand D sub T. Asset demand D sub A. So what are the differences between those kinds of demand? Well, transactions demand are what you would think that they are. That's money for the demand for money to be used to make transactions, to pay bills, to buy items of a routine nature, to pay ordinary expenses, and that's based on that would be a sort of household's view of it. From a business's view of it, would be to pay ordinary expenses like payroll and inventory costs and payables and things of that nature. And it would be having money on hand to pay routine, ordinary, short-term sorts of expenses. And I think that the short and long run issue is important here. Asset demand is entirely different. And this looks a little bit different than what people would maybe expect, although not based upon, it's a downward sloping curve, and I'll get to you here in a minute. You might think, well, that's a demand curve, but we're going to see why that looks the way it does. Asset demand is demand for money to be used as a store of value. So we've taken the supply of money and linked it up with the demand for money. So therefore, what are we trying to build? We're trying to build a model of the money market. A model of the money market. So let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and erase this and talk about what this looks like. And I want to say a couple things here about the money market, because I know the term money market is used a lot by banks and other financial institutions to refer to a type of account, so a type of transaction account or savings account. They could be checking or savings, and it's really sort of a euphemism for something that has got some sort of yield to it. And I think the term money market checking and money market savings started when some of the deregulation of banking took place, and banks were paying a little bit higher rates on deposits than what they are now. Today, we don't use that term very much, money market, mostly because Banks don't pay much in the way of interest at all right now, as you may be aware. So I just want to make sure that that's not what we're talking. We're not talking about specific accounts. We're talking about the market for money. That is the supply and demand for money. So what do we got here? We've got this. We've got, first of all, we've got transactions demand. Okay, and let's talk about what that looks like here. So transactions demand, D sub T. And then we're going to also take into account asset demand. And asset demand is going to be modeled here. That is D sub A. Actually, let me go ahead and put those there. Okay. Now, what do we got on both of these axes here? Well, okay. So we've got demand for something in two of its forms. So what are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at just basically a model that looks a lot like what we've seen before, where we have price and quantity. Nothing that's terribly different there. Only the price of money is the interest rate. It's the interest rate, so which we'll call letter I, small I for interest rate. And if you go on to take other econ courses in the future, and I know some of you are probably thinking fat chance of that happening, but if you do, you may get into some more exotic modeling where we differentiate the real interest rate from the nominal interest rate. We're not really interested in doing that so much here, and nor are we really going to sort of drill down into just what this I actually is, except to say that I think I may have mentioned at one point earlier that when we say the interest rate, I know sometimes that in itself leads to confusion, because it'd be quite right to say, hey, what do you mean the interest rate? There are all kinds of interest rates on savings accounts, on car loans, on credit cards, mortgages, student loans. There is no one interest rate. They're all over the place, and they really are, aren't they? Well, having said that, if we're doing modeling in economics, we generally focus on the very lowest, very shortest maturity and among the very safest of those, something called the Fed funds rate, which I may get to a little bit later. That's discussed in your book. Fed funds rate is basically an overnight lending rate, bank to bank. That's really all that it is. In Europe, it's called the LIBOR rate. It's the same thing. It stands for London Interbank Offered Rate. So you may have heard that term before. Maybe you haven't. I know I had a mortgage at one time tied to the LIBOR rate. It's just an interest rate. And I only bring that up not to muddy the waters, but to maybe try to get a little bit of clear up some of the confusion as to what we mean by the interest rate. Okay. Okay. So the price of money, which is defined, economists will define it as the rental cost of money, which is essentially what is happening when you're if you're a saver, you're actually a lender, aren't you? You're lending money to a bank, you're lending money to a corporation if you buy a bond, or to a government if you buy a government bond. And so it's the price of money. And then if P is on the vertical axis, what's on the horizontal axis it's a Q, and that's being the quantity of dollars. Or just simply a dollar sign will suffice. Okay. And then we're going to take the entire money market here, because both of these are going to be added together sort of mathematically, and we're going to have the market for money. Market for money. And we're going to come back to the market for money once we sort of build a broader model that takes into account the market for money, in addition to the PY plane dealing with the broader economy, and how this looks as the result of Federal Reserve intervention throughout the economy. Okay. So what about these two demands? What do they look like? Well, the first of these, and if you've been reading the book, you've already come across this, you've already seen it, but I want to talk about what it is. So transactions demand is basically a vertical expression. It's not even really a function, because a function fails what's called the vertical line test. Vertical line test says that you've got any two coordinates on here, they can only have one and only one unique ordered pair. Well, here you've got the same horizontal coordinate with any of these different points of coordinate on the vertical axis. So this is constant. And what it really means is this. In fact, this is a rule of thumb for this and any other course you might take ever. And whenever you have on this first quadrant an expression which is either completely vertical or completely horizontal, basically what it's saying is that it's independent of whatever it's parallel to. It doesn't matter what the value is, up, down, it doesn't make any difference. This is going to be whatever this is going to be. And so in other words, the transactions demand for money is relatively fixed. It will rise over time as the economy grows. It will shrink over time. Well, for the most part, in a very short run, the very snapshot of things, we're saying the transactions demand for money is relatively fixed. And if you think about it, it's maybe a bit theoretical, but it's not that theoretical. I mean, I think that particularly for households, and remember, demand for goods in the economy, 2/3 or more actually, of total demand for the economy comes from households, right? Consumer spending. And most households have a fairly constant amount of spending on a routine basis, monthly, quarterly, whatever the case might be. And it doesn't change a lot. And it doesn't change a lot because people fall into patterns. A lot of it's based on people's incomes, which are relatively fixed. And I know that it's, you know, if you're like me and we've got a lot of elderly relatives who always talk about their being on a fixed income, to which I say, well, most people are on a fixed income, you know, or relatively speaking. I mean, unless you are a commission salesperson or working at a job that's got wildly variable hours, or maybe a worker who gets a lot of tips that are up and down. For the most part, the vast majority of households receive a relatively fixed wage. Okay, so as a result, their spending is relatively predictable. And the same goes for businesses, which have a fairly constant flow of business from year to year to year. Hopefully, all of this is moving to the right as the economy grows, so that businesses and individuals can both grow along with it. Now, obviously, in the last couple of years with the COVID pandemic, it's been a more problematic situation. We certainly get that. But nonetheless, it doesn't change the idea that demand for transactions demand is relatively constant. In other words, it doesn't make any difference what the interest rate is. Okay, so if I say that it's vertical, meaning that it's independent of whatever it's parallel to, in other words, the interest rate axis, then what are we really saying? We're saying that it doesn't make any difference what the interest rate is. Our demand for money is going to be, for transactions, is going to be whatever the demand for transactions happens to be. It makes absolutely no difference. Why? Because when's the last time you said, I'm not going to pay my P&M bill because I'm just going to put my money in a savings account this month because I'll earn more on savings than I will by paying P&M. Maybe I pay a late fee, whatever. I don't know. I'd rather do that rather than try to chase an interest rate. It just is not really a viable solution. Okay, so that's asset demand. Or I'm sorry, that's transactions demand. Asset demand looks like this. It's downward sloping. So let's think about this a little bit, because this seems, even though it's downward sloping, and one is tempted to say, well, of course it's downward sloping. It's a demand curve. What would you expect it to be on a price and quantity sort of graph? Well, I think the answer to that is, well, you have to explain why people would demand more dollars as the interest rate falls and demand fewer dollars as the interest rate rises. And this is important for us to understand. It really reflects the opportunity cost of holding money. Okay, money as money, in this case, actual dollars that you would hold as dollars, not dollars as stocks, dollars as bonds. And in fact, the one useful substitute for holding money as money is holding money in the form of bonds. And I'm going to talk about bonds here very shortly because I think it's important for us to really understand what's going on with them, because when we get to talking about monetary policy, that is how the government manages the supply of money and the availability of credit, one of the tools it uses is intervention in the bond market, in particular the Treasury bond market. But in the last several years, the Federal Reserve has been involved in intervening in all kinds of markets. The market for secured car loans, student loans, mortgage loans, all kinds of things, which it hadn't done before. But that's another subject. So why is it downward sloping? So in fact, why would, if the interest rate were high, why would we hold less money? It's because we would rather hold less money and more in the way of bonds, which are yielding more than what money could potentially yield. Now they're riskier, but if we're willing to take the risk and have less in the form of cash in order to chase that risk because it's just so enticing. But as the rate of interest falls, we're more willing to hold cash because the opportunity cost of holding cash becomes less and less. Why? Because there's no higher yield to go chase at the moment. So why should I buy bonds when in fact the interest rate is so low? And by the way, the interest rates have been so low that the bond market has, I think a lot of people are saying, stay away from bonds for now because the rates are so low. And if you only wait, rates are going to go up, and you can probably do better waiting until they come up. It's also an explanation for why the stock market is doing so well, because nobody wants to own savings accounts or CDs or even bonds. They'd rather simply buy stocks, because you can buy a stock and get a rate of return of 3%, 4% per year, which by historical standards is not very much. But when inflation was running at 1%, you're beating inflation and getting a bit of a yield, whereas bonds were paying about that, and with no chance of growing and no chance of the stock of that security doubling probably in value, like stocks can, like certain stocks will do it sometimes. So it becomes less costly to own cash as cash when the interest rate falls. Why take a bigger risk when in fact the interest rate is so low? So we might as well just hold money. And there's a bit of theory which we may get to next time, although we may not, depending on how much time we have. It talks about what happens when the interest rate is so low, and what the effects of that is on the economy. That people don't want to participate in the financial markets, but we'll get to that a bit later. So if you've got demand, transactions demand, which we can basically quantify it in the form of an equation. We put this in the form of an equation. This isn't a functional relationship. This is not a function because it fails the vertical line test, but this is a function. But you can add up any expression Q equals whatever, and whatever this function is, to arrive at what is essentially the demand for money curve, which is also downward sloping, which, by the way, is because of the fact that the asset demand is so much greater than the transactions demand that it's going to have a downward slope to it. And as a result of this, you've got a downward sloping demand for money. And the relationship here is simply this: that transactions demand plus asset demand, it's a T there, transactions demand plus asset demand equals the demand for money overall. Okay. And then we can establish an equilibrium, if there is an equilibrium, and generally speaking, there might be, by sketching the supply of money, which we're going to say from time to time is vertical also. But we should not confuse that with transactions demand. What we're simply saying with the money supply is this: it's the same, it's the I, the price of money, and quantity of dollars here. All we're simply saying is that however much money there is at any one time is however much money there is out there at any one time. In other words, in the form of M1 and M2. And by the way, these numbers are very easily ascertainable. They're easily known. And in fact, the Federal Reserve itself, which is charged with managing the supply of money and the availability of credit, has to know, and in fact, they keep up with it on a daily basis. If you've ever worked for a bank and have been involved in producing what's called a call report, every bank, every day, produces a report that goes to the Federal Reserve detailing the amounts in their M1 accounts or M2 accounts. And then this allows the Federal Reserve to do a lot of things. In particular, allows them also to set aside some money as reserves, or make sure that banks are setting some aside as reserves. We're going to get to that here shortly, but it's the Federal Reserve is very interested in knowing, and it knows pretty much constantly what the supply of money is. And so as a result of this, we end up with simply an equilibrium condition where the equilibrium interest rate, whatever that is that we're using, is all I star and then quantity of dollars, which is Q star in terms of dollars. And so an equilibrium in the market for money. And for the most part, we're saying that equilibrium is achieved on a short-term basis. And yes, it can change. And what can make it change are all kinds of things in the short run. In the long run, what might make them change are, things like economic growth or economic decline. But in the short run, it could be things like intervention in the financial market in the money market by the Federal Reserve itself, and we'll be coming to that very shortly. Okay. All right. So that is essentially what that looks like in terms of the two elements of demand. And I want to talk a little bit about. So there are other questions for that I can answer. Looks like we have how many people do we have? We have about a handful, I think. Looks like there maybe 5 people, something like that. So. Which is fine because it is recorded, even though this is intended to be a live class, we call attend anywhere. The fact that we are recording it is good, and I know some people are already mostly done with the material, but nonetheless, we still are scheduled to have class. So, okay, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about particularly this downward slope and why it's important and why we should know about it. I'm going to erase this, I think. because I want to talk a bit more about this interplay between interest rates and how they affect demand for money. And it's one of these deals where I want to describe why something is by describing the substitute for that thing. So I'll leave this up here for now. In other words, what is the substitute for money when it comes to asset demand, which gives rise to this downward slope in the asset demand curve, or the asset demand for money curve? And it's because of the fact that there is a substitute for money as money to be used as a store of value, money to be used as M2, money to be used to generate interest, and that's the bond market. So when we talk about bonds, what are we really talking about with respect to bonds? Bonds are simply defined as long-term IOUs, and that's really all that they are. And I think I got these slides a little bit, probably out of order a little bit. I probably should have moved that one slide. It goes beyond the tools of monetary policy. I probably should have moved that up one, so maybe I'll do that. I think I did that on mine. I didn't do it on the course, the one I posted in the course. So if you're following along that slide package, just go to, we're talking about the bond market. And what does it say bonds are defined as? It's sort of a global market for long-term IOUs. And they're long-term, when we talk about bonds, with the exception of like very short-term treasury securities like treasury bills, so-called T-bills, which can mature as little as 90 days. And then there are notes which run from 6 months to say 5 years. For the most part, most bonds, which are non-treasuries, are long-term. They run several years, some as long as 30 years. There are some bonds which are out there called perpetuities, which never have a maturity date at all, ever. And in fact, I don't know if your book talks about this, but they're called consol bonds. Consol meaning consolidation. It's when the British 200 years ago were fighting Napoleon. They incurred a ton of debt from European banks in order to do it, and decided, hey, what are we going to do with all this debt? We're just going to simply put it in one big, gigantic bond package that's never going to mature. And so the British have been paying interest on that for 200 years, and they have no plans to stop paying interest on it. So there are bonds that have been around for a very long time. And so we sometimes do see that happen. But for the most part, there's a maturity date. Usually 30 years is about as long as they go. But here's the thing about bonds that is important to know. Well, a couple things. Number one, it's a much more important market from a monetary economist's standpoint than the stock market. Even though, and I know that I'm as guilty as anybody else who watches economic news all day long, and that is the stock market is very exciting. It's there's a lot going on. There's a lot to look at. It's a way to make vast short-term profits quickly if you're willing to take risks and use other people's money in order to do it. And so I get that, and I know there are all kinds of exotic ways to hedge your money with options and some other kinds of things. So it gets a lot of press is what I'm saying. That's what we hear the most. If you watch the news at night, you'll see what happened in the stock market, but you'll hear practically nothing about the bond market, which is much larger, much older, has been around a long time, and is much more important to the economy in terms of the function of the economy than is the stock market, arguably. But it's the stock market that gets all the attention. And I know I probably spend more time talking about looking personally at the stock market than I do the bond market, but it's mostly because it's changing a lot, where the bond market, thankfully, is much more stable. And I say thankfully because it's one of those deals where things which are stable in macroeconomics are usually considered to be a good thing. So, but I want to talk about this idea of the relationship between bond prices and interest rates. And when we talk about the interest rates expressed as a percentage, obviously, and we say there's an inverse relationship between bond prices and interest rates in general throughout the economy. And when we talk about the bond market, we could do entire classes on the bond market, which obviously we're not going to do. But we are going to talk about some important things here, and that is this idea of what does it mean by this inverse relationship? And more importantly, since this is not an investment class, what does it mean to our study of macro and why does it matter? And it matters because, for the most part, I mean, what are we really talking about here in chapter 16? We're talking about monetary policy. The actions of our central bank, the Federal Reserve, are geared around toward working and intervening in the bond market. So an understanding of how the bond market works would be pretty important. And in fact, the Fed obviously does understand that. But let's talk a bit about what is going on here in terms of what the relationship is between the price of the bond and the interest rate in general. So we can simply say this, that the interest rate I, which is really expressed as a percentage, right? In all cases, which we know there's nothing unusual there. And it's equal to the dollar amount of the coupon payment. That's the dollar amount of the payment that arrives, which we can express on an annual basis or a semi-annual basis, since a lot of bonds pay interest semi-annually, that is every 6 months. And it's basically a percentage of the face amount. Percentage of the face amount. And the face amount is usually $1,000. That's almost always what it is. It's a percentage of the face amount. So it's the coupon dollar payment divided essentially by the price of the bond, P sub B, the price of the bond. And that's what the interest rate is. Now here I want to stress the fact that the interest rate, we're simply saying that it's the yield to the investor is what the interest rate here is, okay? That is, what is the amount that is returned to the investor, whoever the investor is. And when it comes to the bond market, it's not so much dominated by individuals as it is by institutions like insurance companies in particular, other banks in particular, pension funds in particular. Yes, there are individuals who buy bonds, but they might often invest in them indirectly through these other sorts of intermediaries, okay? So here's the thing. Let's say that there's a 6% bond. That's the scenario, okay? So the example is a 6% bond. In other words, you buy a bond that is newly issued, it pays 6%, okay, as an annual yield. I may need to, well, maybe that. I was going to say maybe I need to erase some of this. And maybe I do. Make it easier to see, probably. Hopefully you've got that. So we have a 6% bond. So what are we really saying here is this, that the interest rate on this, the yield to the investor as a percentage is the annual payment in dollars, $60 divided by $1,000, which is usually the face amount when it's issued. I know sometimes these are issued and interest rates change, and they may go for a little more, a little less, but it's going to be 0.06, which, to get rid of the decimal sign, you simply multiply by 100, and you get 6%. Okay. And again, it's one of those deals where we've seen this now a couple of times. Multiplying something by 100 just gets rid of the decimal in order to express something as a percentage. Okay. Now, what if things are changing in the economy? Interest rates are changing, and as a result, bond prices change because interest rates are changing. Why would they do that? Well, think about this. Let's say that, and I know that there are issues concerning the safetiness of a bond. If it's a corporate bond, you know, not all bonds are the same. Some are very, very safe, like a bond issued by, I don't know, Microsoft would probably be a very safe bond compared to a bond issued by a much riskier proposition like a startup or maybe some new company engaged in something very speculative and wants to issue debt. They would probably pay a higher interest rate because of the fact that it's a riskier proposition. Risk and return go in the same direction. The higher the risk, the higher the return. Well, so what if rates in general are rising and 6% is no longer applicable to a bond of this particular safety? And so as a result, people aren't willing to pay as much for this particular bond. So now the price of the bond has fallen. But what's happened is it's the same yield to the investor. This is expressed as a percentage. It's the same $60. And so what has happened is this. Now, 60 divided by by 940, which is the price of the bond. Bond is less attractive, so it will cost less. And it'll now go to 6 3/8 or 6.38%. So as a result, what has happened? The bond price has gone down, the bond yield has gone up. And they're both part and parcel of the same reality. To get this particular bond that's only paying 6%, I'm willing to pay less so that my yield, my annualized yield is adjusted for that, for the cost that I'm paying for it. Okay, why would this be the case? Because maybe new bonds are coming out paying 6.3 something percent. And so as a result, I'd rather buy those, or I could still buy this, but I'm willing to pay less. And so the market will drive that price down. So the price goes down and the yield goes up. And one is the same as a part and parcel of the same relationship. Consequently, what about the other scenario where rates in general now are falling throughout the economy for whatever reason? And we'll detail what some of these scenarios might be that can cause either rises or falls in interest rates. So now rates are falling. That $60 on $1,000, what would be $1,000 bond, looks pretty good. That 6% actually sounds pretty good. So I'm now willing to pay more for this bond. And it's now 60, but the price has gone up to 1,080, not 1,000, which is the face amount, which is what's going to pay at maturity, by the way. But if you're very close to the maturity, then it's not going to be as big per $1,000. I think that's probably safe to say. And so you end up then with the case in which the yield now falls to 0.556 or 5.56%. In other words, the price has gone up and the yield has gone down. So what can we say about this relationship? There's inverse relationship between interest rate and the price of the bond. The interest rate goes up, the price of the bond falls. Interest rate goes down, the price of the bond goes up. And this is a lot like the demand curve, or the demand function, isn't it? A lot like the law of demand in general. And in fact, this is what determines essentially the demand for bonds, assuming that we have controlled for things like safety. If we're talking about corporate bonds, things like the safety of the bond, the solvency of the issuer, all those kinds of things. If we have accounted for those, taken those into account, all things remaining the same. That is what's called Ceteris Pyramid. That was a Latin term that was early on in your textbook. All else remaining equal, this is the relationship that's going to hold. And interest rates can change for all kinds of different reasons that have nothing to do with the actual bond issue itself. There's nothing that's changed with the bond issuer necessarily. And by the way, in the case of the US government, we're saying that there's nothing with regard to the safety of US bonds that should be called into question. I know that a few years ago, one of the ratings agencies, and when we talk about ratings agencies, we're talking about companies like Standard & Poor's and Moody's and Fitch. These are just companies they're just research companies that produce lots of data and do a lot of research. And they make their money by selling that research on a customized basis to any client that asks. A lot of them are big banks that ask for them, but they'll publish a lot of their information. They actually downgraded US debt, and this was Standard & Poor's that did this, not the other agencies, but Standard & Poor's. And it was thought to be, they really looked a bit silly. They were sort of a laughing stock because they did it because the US government has never defaulted on debt. There doesn't seem to be any prospect whatsoever that they would default on debt. And that if in fact the US was such a bad borrower, then why does it have no trouble borrowing money whatsoever at almost nothing? Right now, the rate of interest on a 10-year bond, so if you lock up your money for 10 years and lend it to the US government, I think the rate of interest right now is about 1.5%. And inflation is running about 6%. You're actually losing money in real terms by buying a US bond, which leads people to wonder, why does anybody want to buy US bonds? And by the way, that was a question that one of the CEOs of one of the big banks said, that they said something to the effect of, you'd be crazy to buy treasury bonds right now. And in fact, who's been doing a lot of the buying has been the Federal Reserve itself. Keep in mind that the Federal Reserve is different than the Treasury. The Treasury issues the debt because it's the agent for fiscal policy, that is government borrowing to finance the deficit. The Federal Reserve is a monetary authority. And if there was and I forget what page it was on, I referenced it in my last video. There's a pie chart that showed who owns the debt. Some of it was owned by foreign actors and some of it owned by states. And the Federal Reserve is a big buyer of those bonds. In fact, the Federal Reserve owns a lot of the debt, which then leads us to wonder, can the Federal Reserve simply forgive some of the debt? And there's been a lot of talk about that recently. The Federal Reserve may at some point just say, okay, one way to reduce the national debt is to simply say, okay, it's forgiven. Boom. And it may do that. There has been precedent for that. Some of that may happen in the future. Okay. All right. So are there questions for me about that? Let me just make sure we're still recording here, because I know that I was recording last Thursday, or well, not last Thursday, 2 weeks ago, Thursday, and the recording got shut off somehow. So I just wanted to verify that we're I'm a little paranoid about that now. So, okay, well then let's go on to, we've been talking about monetary policy, we've been talking about the Federal Reserve. Let's talk a bit now about the tools of monetary policy and what they are. And if you've been reading ahead in the book, you've probably come across some of these at this point and have read about them, but I'll talk a little bit more about them so that hopefully they'll be more clear if you do want some clarity as to what's going on with those. But there are essentially three tools of monetary policy. There is a fourth sort of tool in the toolbox that's not actually called a tool, and for reasons that I'll get to here in a bit. But there are really three main tools that we'll talk about. The first of these is something called the reserve ratio. the reserve ratio. I'm having trouble getting this to erase. Geez. Somebody sprayed this board with something. So, okay, so one of these tools of monetary policy. And I don't, if this is not dark enough, I hope somebody will let me know. I'm trying my best to, I know that there were some problems in the older room, but let me know. So one of the three tools of monetary policy, the first of these is known as the reserve ratio. Okay. Or more formally known as the required reserve ratio. Required reserve ratio, and sometimes, particularly in the banking world, we'll simply call it the triple R. Required reserve ratio. What is it? Why is it important, and what's it all about? First of all, what are required reserves? You've maybe come across some of this in your readings. What are required reserves? Required reserves are basically percentages of bank deposits that depository institutions have to set aside every single banking day that can't be loaned, can't be invested. All they're doing is sitting on deposit at their Federal Reserve District Bank, and they're just sitting aside. They're just sitting on the bench. They're not doing anything. Historically, they have not earned interest, so it's money that's being parked there without any kind of return back to the bank. Beginning around 2007, I think the Federal Reserve began paying interest on deposit on reserves, just to sort of inject a little bit of money into the banking system, because banks were having a bit of difficulty. It was even before we got into the full-blown recession, beginning of 2008, even a year before that, there were problems with subprime loans, and a lot of those were on banks' books, and there was a lot of concern about, hey, these subprime loans are problems, and so the Federal Reserve was beginning to pay some of the banks for it. So that's what the required reserve ratio is. It's a certain percentage. At the moment, I believe there's only the ratio is 10%. I think it's only on M1 deposits right now. I don't believe there is any on M2. And I say I believe, I don't follow it on a daily basis, and we'll talk about why most people don't follow it on a daily basis here in a minute. But that's what it essentially is the percentage that banks must set aside. They can't be loaned, they can't be invested. It's money that's taken out of play, in other words. It's in the money supply, but it's not really, because it's being withdrawn. And the Fed can use this as a tool in order to influence the economy. The second of these is known as the discount rate. And the discount rate is simply this. It is the rate of interest charged by the Federal Reserve on borrowings directly from it to member banks. Member banks go to the Federal Reserve when they want to borrow money, and they borrow short-term loans up to, say, 90 days is, I think, typical. And they fill out an application, and it's called approaching the discount window. The term window is an old school term, like going to a teller window and whatnot. A bank would actually make an application with the Federal Reserve to take out a loan through the discount rate. And the discount rate itself is simply the interest rate charged on those borrowings. Okay, so the discount rate is the second of those tools. And the discount rate itself, if the discount rate's moving up or down, it's sometimes a harbinger for what's happening throughout the economy in general. It's a signal for where the Fed would like policy to go. So that's the second of those tools. The third tool is something called open market operations. And we talked last time about, when we talked about the structure of the Fed, we said there was a committee, standing committee of the Federal Reserve called the Federal Open Market Committee, whose main job is to do monetary policy, that is defined as the supply, managing the supply of money and the availability of credit. And one way it does that is through open market operations, which are defined as what? The active buying and or selling of securities, notably bonds, in the financial markets in order to influence the amount of currency in play or not in play, in order to boost aggregate demand or restrict aggregate demand, in order to raise GDP or to lower GDP. So that's essentially what is going on with that. So let's talk about the direction of monetary policy, and then the direction these tools will work. There's a great graph in your book. It's like on the left side of one of the pages, I forget. But let's say that we are just, I'll sort of sum it up here to put all this in one sort of matrix. So the direction of monetary policy. Let's say the Federal Reserve has two choices: one, to raise GDP or to lower GDP. And here, all we are going to do is simply refer back to why the Fed would want to either raise or lower GDP, for what purpose. because it doesn't seem like the Fed or any government entity would prefer higher GDP than lower GDP. Why would it want to bring down GDP ever? Because what that's going to do is obviously create unemployment, slow down the economy, weaken business profits, weaken payrolls, weaken tax revenues, all that kind of thing. Well, it might want to do it if there's inflation to slow the economy down, to bring things down. And we'll get into the graphing of that here shortly. To slow things down, they might want to do that. Speeding things up would be to raise GDP. Okay, so that's what's going on there. So what about the impact on the tool with either of these direct? By the way, let's just go ahead and recreate this down the line here. Y goes up, Y goes down, Y goes up, Y goes down. Same issue there, all the way across, all the way down. Okay. So what is the impact on the tool from either of those? Impact on the tool. In other words, what is the change in the tool going to be? In this particular case, if the Fed wants the economy to grow, it's going to lower the reserve ratio. Now, why would it lower the reserve ratio? Well, think about what this means, okay? If the Federal Reserve lowers the amount of required reserves, the percentage amount that banks have to set aside of the deposits, then it means that they are freeing up some of the money that would just go to the Fed and sit on the bench and not be in the game. It's freeing those up, and so now a bank can lend it, they can invest it. In other words, they can put it to work in the economy. So as a result, lowering it will have the effect of putting more money to play in the economy, because as we know, and as we've seen before, what banks do is take people's deposits and they create a liability. And I know we didn't get into this in chapter 15. It wasn't assigned, but I sort of said, because I know there was discussion in chapter 16 about the assets and liabilities of a bank. And I know you've had accounting at this point, so you're familiar with the general idea of assets and liabilities. But if you wanted a little bit more background on it, you could have chapter 15, which is a fairly straightforward chapter. It's not assigned just because it's from time constraints. It's not really that critical, but it's an important one to look at. And if in fact, a bank wants to improve its assets to loan more money, it'll be helped along by having less that it has to set aside on reserve of the Federal Reserve. So if the Fed wants to speed the economy up, it can lower the reserve ratio, thereby freeing up money to be put in play. It can do just the opposite of wanting to slow things down. This takes money out of play by raising the reserve ratio, takes money out of play in the economy. Okay? Same goes here with the discount rate. The Fed wants to improve the economy and speed things up. It will lower the discount rate. If it wants to slow things down, it will raise the discount rate. One of the reasons for that, as we'll see, is just in general, what is the impact on borrowing if rates are changing? One of the things that we know about the discount rate is this, and among the things in which it does is it serves to communicate the direction the Federal Reserve believes interest rates should go. And when we say should go, in order to achieve its dual mandate of maximum employment and maximum price stability. And if there's a gap in that, then the Fed will take action to make that happen. Right now, we look to be pretty close to maximum employment, right? Unemployment rate between 4% and 5%, which is where we are, right? With inflation running at a pretty hot clip, the Fed may want to slow the economy down. There's a lot of indication that they will, which I think is pointing to higher interest rates coming down the road. And I think probably if I were advising people who are looking to buy a house, I would say get on that pretty quickly because I think rates are going to go up at some point. And I could be proven wrong, particularly if this inflationary period is just temporary and transitory. And once the supply chains get worked out and whatnot, things will be back to normal. And we know that we've heard these stories about ships being backed up into the Pacific Ocean, unable to dock because they're in line at the port of Long Beach in LA. In fact, I was having lunch today with some colleagues here. We're waiting on laptops. We're getting new laptops apparently, and they think that they're on back order, and the feeling is they're probably sitting on a ship somewhere in the ocean. Well, we'll see whether or not those kinks get worked out, and that brings down inflation. So therefore, the Fed won't have to raise rates to slow things down. We will see. Okay. So that's the discount rate. What about open market operations? What if the Fed wants to improve interest rates? Well, here, there's no up-down kind of thing to it. Instead, what we're talking about is the Fed here is a net buyer of securities. And I say net buyer because they may be selling, but they may be buying and selling securities. And in fact, if you ever look at the Fed's balance sheet, the Federal Reserve itself has a balance sheet. It's publicly available information, and they may do buying and selling. But in the case of an expansionary policy, it'll be a net buyer. And in the case of a contractionary policy, it'll be a net seller. And let's talk a bit about what these are about, because we're going to see these occur again. And we'll get into some of the graphics of this as we get a little bit deeper into this chapter toward the very end. When we're talking about a rise in GDP, we're talking about expansionary policy, okay? This is not all that different than what we talked about with expansionary fiscal policy. That is, if the government is wanting to expand output and income throughout the economy, an expansionary policy is what it will do. And if it looks to bring things down the other direction, it'll engage in a contractionary policy. So expansionary and contractionary policy can be either fiscal or monetary. And one would think that they would both fiscal and monetary authorities would work together in order to coordinate these. And that is often the case. In fact, in the last, since the housing crisis and the whole banking fiasco of 2008, I think it's safe to say that they have been working mostly in tandem with one another, because it's been obvious that's the direction that it should go. However, I will say this, that that's not always the case. And sometimes there's a push-pull going on where maybe, let's say the Congress wants to do one thing and maybe speed the economy up to boost employment and whatnot, so that voters are happier and whatnot, and they don't have to raise taxes or anything like that. When the Federal Reserve is saying, "Whoa, we got to slow things down because inflation is becoming a problem. We got to hit the brakes." So Congress could want to hit the gas, and the Fed could want to hit the brakes, and that is a conflict. That is a problem, and there's no easy answer for it, particularly given the fact that, as we talked a bit about last time in the last video, that we said that the Fed was mostly independent. They're a semi-independent autonomous agency. And I know that some textbooks, I think this textbook might have even said something to the effect that it's a quasi-public or almost a private entity, the Federal Reserve. It's not really, it's a part of the government. It's a government entity. It's actually part of the executive branch. I mean, the members are nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. It's just that they don't work under the oversight of the president. And in fact, there have been cases in the past in which presidents and White Houses in general have wanted Fed policy to go one direction, and they've been very clear. I know during the first Bush administration, the father, George H.W. Bush, was looking for easier monetary policy to speed the economy up, while the Fed was going in the other direction. And they made it very public, and it was probably a mistake, because the Fed sort of went against the wishes of the White House, just, I think, to demonstrate that they were not beholden to the elected side of the economy. And I think it was very important for the Federal Reserve at that time to do that. But typically that's not the case. There tends to be minimum pressure. And in fact, most presidents are judicious enough not to talk about monetary policy really at all. I can't think of President Biden talking at all about it. President Obama, I don't think, talked about it. President Trump would occasionally weigh in on monetary policy a little bit. I know that he was not happy with Janet Yellen when she was chairman, did not renominate her, and they was not happy with Mr. Powell, Jerome Powell, who was the current chairman, and probably would not renominate him either. President Biden is renominating him. His renomination for 4 years as chairman is pending right now, even though he has 14 years as a member of the board in general, 4 years at a time as chairman. Usually when their terms are done, they leave the board anyway. Okay, so it is possible for that to happen. So net buyer basically means that they're, in the case of an expansionary policy, they're buying more than they're selling. And in the case of a contractionary policy, they're selling more than they're buying. Okay, so questions about that? Okay, so we talked about the impact on the tool. What about the impact on aggregate demand? What is that going to do? In other words, what is the change in aggregate demand? And therefore, what is the ultimate impact on the economy? And the final column that we're going to talk about here is the relative effectiveness. And by relative effectiveness, I mean it's the relative effectiveness of each tool, the term relative being relative to each other. That is how critical, how effective our reserve ratio as that tool in relation to the discount rate, in relation to open market operations, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that would be the last thing that we talk about here. So change in aggregate demand, what are we talking about here? If in fact the Fed's looking for expansionary policy, you don't want aggregate demand to go up. In the case of contractionary policy, aggregate demand to go down. This will go in the same direction all the way across as GDP, because of the fact that we have seen that the Federal Reserve, that aggregate demand does tend to drive GDP. It's an important aggregate of that. And then the same goes with net buying and net selling. And in the last several years, the Federal Reserve unquestionably and very openly and transparently has been a net buyer of securities, bonds in particular, in the financial markets, in order to do what? To put money into play in the economy, in order to boost aggregate demand, in order to do what? To raise GDP. And in fact, if you think about it, it's really been doing that for the last 20 years, actually. Since 9/11, the Federal Reserve has had a very low accommodative policy, because what are all the hallmarks of an accommodative policy? A net buyer of securities. The Federal Reserve has been pumping tons of money into the financial markets to create cash, basically exchanging cash for securities. The Fed gets the securities, the private economy gets the cash. Lower interest rates, which is what we've been certainly seeing up until now, and reserve requirements are mostly stable. But we're going to talk next about what the relative effectiveness of these are. So of these three tools, then, what can we say about them? How are they all created equal? Are they all pretty effective at doing the job that they're intended to do? So let's talk about these individually. So really, we talk about the reserve ratio, and how effective is it at influencing the amount of aggregate demand and GDP? And we're going to say that it's fairly ineffective. It's fairly ineffective. So why are we talking about it? Well, we talk about it, number one, because it's got a role to play in determining monetary or contractionary expansion. There's another multiplier, which we're going to talk a bit about tonight, that is based upon this. And also, the reserve ratio has changed a bit over the years. And in fact, I read a paper by the Federal Reserve a few years ago that talks really about the history of the reserve ratio, where at one time, the reserve requirement was mostly there to prevent against a failure of the banking system due to bank runs. And if you are not familiar with the term bank run, a bank run is simply where everybody wants their money out of the bank. And if you've seen the movie, you know, it's a good Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life. I think I talked about that, where the little bitty bank that Jimmy Stewart is the head of has a full-fledged bank run. Everybody wants their deposits back. Well, the deposits aren't there because they've converted those deposits to other assets like loans and investments. They just simply can't. If to make good on those deposits, they would have to call in loans, and even though most loan agreements allow for that, it's just really not done. And so this leads into really the next issue here, is the fact that yes, at one time that was really the purpose, but today it's more symbolic. It is also more of a monetary control issue. Even though it's not very effective and it's not changed very much. And one big issue that's probably not talked about very much, but I can tell you has a real impact, and that is when the Federal Reserve changes reserve ratio, it drives bankers crazy. And of course, it doesn't take much to drive bankers crazy. I haven't been one for a lot of years, but it messes up their budgets a lot when the reserve ratio changes, because they're going to immediately make a lot of changes to what they are planning on doing. And if in fact the Fed keeps moving this up, down, then it really plays havoc, because keep in mind, when we talk about these reserves have got to be met every single banking day. That is, a percentage of deposits have got to be set aside at the Fed. Now, what happens if there's a very large withdrawal that day? Or they admit an unusually large loan that day and they can't do it? Well, then there's another means by which banks can get the funds. It's simply known as the Fed funds tool, the Fed funds, which is, and the rate on the Fed funds tracks along with the discount rate, but it's a little bit different. Fed funds is one way to do it. Banks have to meet that ratio every night. If they don't, it's a big issue. But fortunately for banks, they have a tool called the Fed funds mechanism where they can borrow money from others Some banks have excess reserves. They simply are willing to lend it to other banks. They're paid a rate of interest. It's usually an overnight rate. So it'd be however much money there is times that rate divided by 365 if it's a one-day loan. Now, one of the things that became very problematic in 2008, going into 2000, actually beginning 2007, was for the first time in my lifetime, certainly, banks did not trust that Fed funds mechanism because nobody knew how unsafe the banking system was. This was a very, very unusual situation because up to this point, I think everybody would have agreed that banks are as solid as the Rock of Gibraltar. They were, there's no problem with banks. They're, they go to great pains to show that they're strong. They have big, tall buildings of marble and granite interiors and steel vaults, but yet they can be very shaky if they've got bad loans on the books, which nobody knew how bad some of these subprime mortgage loans were. Some of them were very bad, and the whole thing came crashing down. And so that mechanism to meet reserve requirements was breaking down because a lot of banks did not want to lend money to other banks because they didn't know how safe all these other banks were. That is an absolutely unprecedented situation. And it reminds me of a time in which, and there was a private investor, Warren Buffett, who came to the aid of Goldman Sachs and loaned them a gigantic amount of money because all financial firms were basically deemed banks at that time as a temporary measure. And it reminds me of when JP Morgan, the man of JP Morgan, came to the rescue of the banking industry under very unusual circumstances. And so, so this is not very effective because it doesn't change very much. And if it doesn't change very much because it makes bankers' lives difficult, then why have it? Well, it's used as a tool, as a monetary tool. If it does change, then it's really sending a signal that it wants things to be different in the economy, but it doesn't change very often. So we're saying it's fairly ineffective. The discount rate, what about that? How effective is this as a tool, relatively speaking? We're going to say this is also fairly ineffective. And in fact, the reason for this is that it is considered to be mostly symbolic. Okay, so it's fairly ineffective. It's mostly symbolic. So what are we talking about here? We're not doing very well, are we? We're 0 for 2, and we've only got 3 to go with here. So why is this not very effective? Well, there are a couple of reasons why. Number one, the discount window is not a preferred place for banks to seek capital when they want to get money. Number one, it's a public event, and number two, there historically it's been a stigma for a bank to go to the Federal Reserve to borrow money because it's public information. Other banks know when it's happening, and it's almost a signal to the world that we're in trouble because the Fed is the lender of last resort. It's the only place we can go raise money, and so it almost signals, hey, we're in trouble. Again, banks want to do everything possible collectively to present this image of safety and stability, because a run on banks where people take their money in deposits and flee means the house of cards begins to fall. And I think I mentioned to you that my very first day in banking, a senior executive told us that a bank is a house of cards. It simply cannot succeed if everyone takes their money out. They have to have confidence in the bank, which is why banks go to great lengths to make sure the confidence is there. And in general, it's deserved. I mean, they do a generally pretty good job of managing that. So there has been this stigma over a very long time period that banks don't want to go to borrow from the discount window because number one, it's short-term money. It's got to be repaid at some point. And number two, it looks like they're in trouble, and so it doesn't want to send that signal to the world. Also, and I guess number three is the fact that it's almost like borrowing money from your parents, where if you don't repay at a certain given promised date, they're on you about it. And why did you go buy ice cream if you still owe me money? That's really Big Brother is watching. So the discount rate is they don't want to borrow from mom and dad. In other words, banks would like to stay away from that. So it's not used very much. And when it is, it's historically been as a lender of last resort. I remember in 2007 when the subprime mortgage thing was first getting going, though, the Federal Reserve tried to change this definition or this mindset. And Ben Bernanke was the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time, and he was brand new on the job. And it said, look, let's change the let's change the mentality. He goes, not only should you not not worry about it, we're encouraging you to borrow, whether you need the money or not. Come borrow from us, which that's a little bit of a different song that the Federal Reserve had not sung up to that point. That was maybe only limited success. So as a result, it's mostly symbolic. Now, what is the symbolism? The symbolism says that if the rate's going up or down, it's a signal to where the Fed thinks rates ought to be going in the economy in order to control either unemployment or inflation, the two perils it's trying to prevent against. And so if the discount rate does move, and by the way, whenever you hear on TV that the Federal Reserve did this to interest rates or did that to interest rates, and you haven't heard it recently because it's been several years, it's been since I think 2005, in which they raised rates and then began lowering them dramatically throughout 2007, 2008, where they've basically been stuck at almost zero for a very long time. But when you do hear that they're changing rates, they're usually changing the discount rate, which is mostly symbolic, and the Fed funds rate, which is not listed here as a tool, mostly because it's not the Federal Reserve's money, and it can only target that rate. It can only intervene to try to influence that rate. But when it does influence what's called the target rate for that, it's an interest rate. It's considered to be communicating rate information to the economy. Okay, so fairly ineffective. Well, we better have better success here, and we do. And so we're saying with open market operations, it is very effective. And it's very effective because it's very fast. It can happen very, very quickly. And the Federal Open Market Committee meets about every 8 weeks. And if you've read this in your book, you will know who sits on the Open Market Committee. It's the 7 members of the Board of Governors plus 4 rotating members, presidents of the 12 district banks. They rotate on a regular schedule, 1-year schedule. And then the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is a permanent member. And they meet about every 8 weeks. But in an emergency situation, they can meet like in a day or two. They just say, we're having a meeting, and they get together. And they did that during the financial crisis of 08, 09. They would have periodic meetings on a moment's notice. They would come together and make pretty radical changes, including changing the money supply. And they would change the money supply in order to increase aggregate demand and increase GDP. And that's, and I say increase because that was the stance for a long time with regard to policy. And I know Ben Bernanke, the chairman at the time, was interviewed on 60 Minutes, and they said, how did you put money into the economy? What did you do? And he said, we just went into the computer and did it. And that was not even open market operations. That was just simply dropping money on the books of banks, something the Fed has not done ever that I have been familiar with. Okay. All right. So any questions for me about any of this in terms of the tools and in terms of how they work, et cetera? You can sort of read, I think we've covered all of that on the slideshow there. And then we'll get into a bit of theory in a minute. But if anybody has any questions, this might be probably a pretty good time to take a short break. So why don't we take a break here until about, say, 7, and that's about 10 minutes from now, and we'll come back. That'll also give you some time to do some setup on the next thing, which I'm going to get into some of the workings of these directional tools and what the effects are on aggregate demand and on GDP. And so I'll get into that a bit. So are there questions for me before we do that? Okay, well, let's take a short break, and then we will reconvene and we'll pick it back up. Okay, I think it's about 7, and it's a good thing we take a break here. Right? This was pretty pretty time consuming to put together, and unfortunately, because we're doing this on video, we've only got one board to work with. So anyway, bear with me. So what we're doing here is I want to sort of put a couple things together. And the first thing I want to point out is I want to put the market for money together with the goods market. In other words, what are we really talking about here? We talk about money. What are we, going back to the circular flow model we talked about quite some time ago? What are we really talking about here? We're talking about the physical flow, right? I'm sorry, the financial flow within the economy. That is the flow of goods and services. And so, in other words, the so-called money economy is reflected there in this particular, in the money market, the market for money. Now, keep in mind, too, that you may hear the term capital markets as opposed to money market. Capital markets would include things like the stock market, things like mutual funds and whatnot. They're considered to be longer term sorts of things. And the money market itself is very short term. Just like the supply of money, it is whatever the supply of money is, but it's going to be a short term nature. It's going to change. I mean, we know the money supply is probably going to change over time. But anyway, that's the financial flow of the circular flow model. And the goods market is simply the physical flow, even though that term is maybe a little bit outdated. The quote unquote real economy is noted there. Okay. So we've seen this graph before, just here a minute ago. And we've seen now for a couple of weeks of this particular graph on the PY plane. That's really the first true macro model that we've built. So the only thing different is investment. And the I here, capital I, is investment spending. And it's the same I that we've talked about before in C plus I plus G. That is the expenditures approach to GDP. It's the demand for investment. So remember, investment is one of those elements of demand: consumption, investment, government spending, and then the plug value of net exports to open the economy up to the rest of the world. But it's one of those elements of demand that is spending on capital goods, that is business use goods by businesses, only things which businesses would buy. Things like semi-trucks and tractors and plows and cranes, conveyor belts, things like that. And the thing that we should know about this is the fact, and we've talked about this before, is the idea that it's the most volatile portion of spending. Where we said that when we first got into sort of tearing apart the elements of GDP from the expenditures approach, that is the demand side of the economy, we said that consumer spending was stable, and that was a good thing because it was about 70% of the economy, about 2/3. And we said that investment, we can't really say what it is as a percentage because it varies, it fluctuates wildly. Sometimes it's in very low single digits, sometimes it's in very high double, like in the teens and whatnot, as percentages of overall demand in the economy. So it's very volatile. And the reason it's volatile is because it's interest sensitive. In other words, if the interest rate is high, investment spending goes down. And so the relationship here is basically this: if a little I is rising, that is the big I, that's the capital investment spending, is going to go down, simply because of the nature of the sensitivity of investment spending to the interest rate. Because remember, what we said about investment was that it was interest sensitive. It's usually big ticket items that are financed with borrowed money. And what is the price of borrowed money? It's the interest rate. And so as a result, if in fact the Federal Reserve is looking to influence interest rates, well, it's certainly going to influence the amount of investment demand, which then is going to translate to aggregate demand throughout the economy. And so let's take the case first of an expansionary monetary policy. So what's going on with an expansionary monetary policy is this. Number one is, well, first of all, so I've got the interest rate, and it's an equilibrium condition. So we'll put a little asterisk, a little star by that. And then we'll go $Q0. That's an equilibrium quantity of money. So that this money market's in equilibrium. But if the Federal Reserve is wanting to do an expansionary monetary policy, what is it looking to do? It's looking to grow GDP. Why? To combat recession and unemployment. So as a result, it's looking to expand the money supply. And it's going to do that by, well, primarily of those three tools, open market operations is the most effective. So what's it going to primarily do? It's going to be a net buyer of securities, primarily government securities, treasury bonds, treasury bills, things of that nature. And then so doing, it's going to bid up the prices. Whenever anyone's in there buying, particularly the giant, King Kong character that the Federal Reserve is, it's going to make an impact. And so if the Fed is in there buying, it's going to drive the price of bonds up. And if it's going to drive the price of bonds up, it's going to drive the interest rate down, which is why we went through that exercise of the inverse relationship between bond prices and interest rates. The Fed's in there buying, and by the way, traders who trade in bonds know when the Fed is intervening because they can see it. The market moves very quickly, which is why monetary policy through open market operations is considered effective. So the money supply will grow as a result of this. So SM0 go to SM1. This is still an equilibrium condition, but now the equilibrium interest rate will fall to I1. And that's going to do what? It's going to increase the amount of investment spending from I0 to I1. So the little I impacts the big I in this case because of the fact that it's so sensitive to the rate of interest. And so as a result, the demand for investment is going to go up. We're not talking about a shift in investment demand because that would be to things that are non-price related. Remember, shifts in these functions are due to non-price variables. Well, the price of investment demand is the cost of money. So it's got to be something else. Maybe it's tax policy or whatever that could shift demand to the right or shift it to the left. But for right now, in a very short-term basis, we're talking about a change in the interest rate because of the Fed's intervening in order to expand the money supply. Buying bonds, driving the price of bonds up and the interest rate down. And keep in mind too, money is now less scarce. The people who yesterday were holding bonds are now holding cash because the Fed bought them from them. And so as a result, money is now less scarce. And so the price of that less scarce thing has come down. And what does that then translate to? If investment demand and all the other elements that are investment sensitive, like consumer durables, are going to respond to it, then we're going to have a shift in aggregate demand to the right. And again, think about when we talk about the PY plane, think about right, left. A rightward change is an increase. And so as a result, GDP goes up from Y0 to Y1. And whether or not we get the increase in the price level is sort of subjective. But yeah, we know and we think that it's probably a bit inflationary. And we are going to talk about, if we have time tonight, we'll talk about the Phillips Curve, which sort of talks about this idea of if you get a little bit less unemployment, maybe you get a little more inflation. I may hold that off till next week because it kind of goes better with that whole theoretical piece that we'll do. But nonetheless, it's not beyond the realm of reason that we might have a rise in the price level, even though we have a new equilibrium condition where equilibrium GDP is going up. But in exchange for that, we've got maybe a little bit of a higher price level. So that's the effect of an expansionary policy. And I hope this is easy to see or easy enough to see down below here. I know this is a very busy, usually I use two different boards when I'm in the classroom when people are here. I'm sort of trying to make do with what I've got here. It did take me a bit of time to set this up. So what about a contractionary policy? What's the effect on the money market? What's the effect on demand for investment? And what's the effect on the goods market? Well, think about this. Contractionary policy is used in order to deal with what? In order to deal with inflation in the economy. And as a result, the Fed is going to want to intervene. So we have some equilibrium condition of Q dollars zero at some interest rate of zero. So if in the most effective form of monetary policy in terms of tools is open market operations, the Fed is a net seller in this case. By selling bonds, by dumping bonds into the market, the price of those bonds falls. Why? If anyone's dumping anything for sale, then the price of that thing goes down. If the price goes down, then the interest rate goes up. And so as a result, what happens is because the Fed's selling bonds, people who were holding bonds yesterday, or I'm sorry, people who were holding cash yesterday are now selling bonds that were sold to them by the Federal Reserve. And again, the Fed will, by dumping them, makes the price attractive so that people will want to part with their cash in order to chase that. So the price goes down, the yield goes up, right? Isn't that the relationship? So as a result, we have an equilibrium interest rate of I0, which now goes to an equilibrium interest rate of I1. Now money is more scarce, and so the price of money goes up because the people who are holding money now are holding bonds in exchange, but they did it willingly because the price of the bonds was attractive and the yield was attractive, which is part and parcel of the same equation, right? That I equals the coupon payment over C, same fixed coupon payment. So if the interest rate goes up, we carry the interest rate over to the investment demand side, same increase in interest rate, whereas we had a decrease here. Now we have a fall in the amount of investment spending. So as a result, I0 falls to I1. And gosh, I hope you can see that. I'm trying my best to try to make this visible, but anyway, I think it's pretty obvious what's happening there. Less investment demand simply because of the fact the interest rate is now going up, and so there's less dollars of investment going in that direction. And then the aggregate demand curve is intended to shift left, and so we have an AD curve which goes from AD0 to AD1. And as a result, achieving the objective of reduced GDP in the economy from Y0 to Y1. And whether or not we get a decrease in the price level is theoretical, really. I mean, I think it depends. If you believe that prices are downwardly inflexible, then you would believe that the price level is not going to change, that once prices get jacked up, they're not going to come back down. And we might have the worst of both worlds, elevated prices and reduced GDP. Right now, that's a concern that a lot of people have, is for those who believe the prices are not downwardly flexible. There are those who believe prices are flexible. I think there's a lot less support for that latter view. I think there's a lot of support for the idea that prices tend not to come down. And again, I talked about the fact that there are some goods that the prices do go down over time, but those are mostly due to the fact that the cost of production has gone down as these goods have risen in popularity and adoption. That's more of a microeconomic thing where as firms get bigger, it costs them less to do whatever it is that they're doing in vast numbers. And so that's why it doesn't cost Apple very much to make an iPhone. The same iPhone that sells for $1,000 costs less and less to make because they're making so many darn iPhones, which is one explanation for why Apple is making money hand over fist. But that's not what's going on macroeconomically. That's a micro relationship. Macroeconomically, we don't see prices really falling. Okay, we don't see prices really falling. So they sort of get stuck with that ratchet effect, the ratchet being the tool that goes up, but it doesn't go down in the other direction. Okay, so this is sort of the linkage now, graphically at least, as to how we put together the money market. That is the sense of red arrows in the circular flow model here, with the green arrows and the circular flow in the money market, linking those together in terms of policy. And I think that there's a lot of debate as to what the effectiveness is of monetary policy versus fiscal policy. And I want to talk a bit about that. And it looks like my laptop is frozen up here a little bit. So, geez, hope I can get to it here. Let's see here. Yeah, let me. Okay. Yeah, I want to skip ahead just a little bit here to talk about monetary policy versus fiscal policy, because I think it makes sense to talk about here. And then I want to go back and pick up some of the elements of monetary theory, and which are going to tie into where we're going to go next time as well. And then I'll get into talking, before we're done, about some of the content from chapter 18, which is going to hopefully sort of tie up some loose ends with regard to particularly aggregate supply, and how we go from this upward sloping aggregate supply to what is considered to be a vertical relationship. So what about monetary versus fiscal policy? And is there a difference, and is there a preference? Is there a view among economists and others as to which is more effective than the other? So what are some of the benefits of monetary policy? Well, it's number one, it's faster. We talked about that. Those lags that we talked about last time, operations lag, administrative lag, implementation lag, which are cumulative, that as one builds into another, which builds into another, are mostly absent when it comes to monetary policy, which is not to say there is not the same implementation lag. The Fed can make these changes to interest rates and money supply, and they could do it pretty quickly, but it's going to take a little bit of time for the private market to react, thereby translating to some change in GDP. So there's still going to be a lag, but what is not so much lagging is this whole idea of the decision lag that comes about simply because of who the actors are with regard to fiscal policy. That is 535 members of Congress and one president. Oftentimes, the president and the House, one or both houses of Congress, are of different parties, and so there's already a natural disagreement over policy orientation. So, and there have been cases in which, certainly in the latter years of the Obama administration, in which he had a very hostile Congress, where not much was getting done simply because of this sort of ideological disagreement. Well, the Fed prides itself on not being particularly ideological and looks more at data, and this was certainly the case under Chairman Yellen, Janet Yellen, and she had always tried to communicate to the public its reasoning and its data-driven sort of analyses in order to show that they're trying to make decisions objectively and in the public interest without regard to any sort of agenda. And that's important, I think, for the Fed to not appear political, and that was part of our discussion question as to why these long terms. In the long terms of 14 years in the Federal Reserve Board, it's to really insulate these members from elected officials, particularly presidents, who often have a large microphone and big bully pulpit. After 14 years, they can outrun any president on the board generally. Yes, I know chairman and vice chairman have 4-year terms, but that's really what's going on there. Those long terms were intended to sort of make them insulated. And I think by and large, it has worked. So from a standpoint of speed, those two lags are taken out of the picture for the most part. And I talked about the fact that the Fed, FOMC can get together fairly quickly within even a day's notice, whereas Congress a lot of times is on vacation for weeks, and they may not convene anytime quickly. And also, I talked about this idea of political pressure being in the minimum. What are some of the shortcomings? Well, number one, reducing the supply of the money supply is a lot easier than, reducing it is a lot more difficult sometimes than expanding it. Reducing it is easier than expanding it. That is, the Fed can intervene and sell things by dumping the market, lowering the price. But sometimes expanding it doesn't always work. And number one, it assumes in this case here that the demand side of the economy is going to react positively. It's going to demand more investment spending, and aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. Here's the problem with this, and we certainly saw this. That is, this issue of contraction being easier than expansion. The evidence for that particular point is just the last few years, where the Federal Reserve is doing everything in its power to push the rate of interest down to near zero, pushing money out into the economy. And this is not anything to do with stimulus and the child tax credit, anything like that. This is strictly monetary, beginning around 2008. And it had only, I think, fairly limited success. And in fact, I think the recession, which began around 2008, took a very long time to recover from. Fortunately, it wasn't as deep as what others have been in the past. But it took a while to get back to full employment. And that was some of the criticism of fiscal policy, was that it wasn't aggressive enough when President Obama took office in his first term. This appears to be something that President Biden has tried to correct by being extraordinarily aggressive with trying to spend money to the point where he had a very long Christmas shopping list that is not probably going to be met by Santa Claus in the form of the Congress. But you got to give him, I guess, credit for trying. He certainly was trying to do things to boost the economy in this direction from a fiscal side. From a monetary side, the economy didn't respond as quickly, and it did take a while. Now, this is very frustrating to President Obama, who really didn't have any kind of control over making people want to spend. And in fact, during the early days of that financial crisis, I remember that this was still in the very end of the Bush administration. President Bush's Treasury Secretary, John Snow, was saying, if people don't want to borrow, we can't make them do that. We can't make people spend money. And he's right. You can't tell somebody, go buy a new car or go buy a new 18-wheeler if you're a business. So, okay, what are some of the shortcomings? There's sometimes ambiguity over what the Fed should do at any time, if anything at all. I think that the way policy is sort of presented in textbooks, and even by instructors, we certainly have our share of blame, is the fact that the Fed is either going one direction or the other, and that it's very clear what it's doing. Is it expanding or is it contracting? There are times, and there have been times in the not too distant past, when the Fed has gone for a good couple of years, 2 or 3 years, it hasn't done very much at all. The economy is mostly on autopilot. It hasn't been either expanding or contracting. It's just not really doing much. And nor should it do much, because I think there's some who would argue that doing too much is better than doing too much is worse than doing too little. And so there are occasional times in which it's not really clear what the Fed should do. I think we're sort of at that point right now, to be honest with you, where the Fed doesn't really know what to do. And we've heard some mixed signals from the Fed as to what it plans to do. There's a lot of talk about the Fed trying to slow the economy down because now we've got inflation happening. That's what would tend to happen, particularly for those who believe that prices are downwardly inflexible. And even if you don't believe that, at least you believe the ratchet effect would at least keep prices stable, even at this elevated level. But there are others who don't necessarily think the timing is right, and the Fed should hold off and wait and see. So it's very uncertain right now. I think we'll know more in the next few weeks. And again, I think all economists that I know are looking to those inflation numbers next week. I think it's going to tell an important story that is going to let us know what's happening. Is this inflation that we're seeing? And by the way, I don't know if all of you are seeing inflation, but I think we're starting to see it pick up. And it isn't just gas prices. I've sort of cautioned, I usually caution macro classes not to look at gasoline as the only harbinger, the only signal that there's inflation, because it can be a false signal. Prices of gas can be going up, prices of everything else can be stable. Your gas prices are going up, and it's partly due to the economy generally inflating. And so I think we'll have to see what happens. Okay, what else? Sometimes the Fed's work, and I think I mentioned this, can be countered by Congress, where the Congress wants to go one way, the Fed wants to go another way. We saw a little bit of this happening during the first Bush administration, where the Bush administration and Congress wanted to step on the gas, increase spending, particularly as the economy was starting to slow down a little bit in the late 80s. And the first President Bush was just coming into office and was wanting to keep things going a little bit, but the economy had been on a very long expansion, and the Federal Reserve, I think, was concerned about inflation. It was starting to tighten, and yet the Bush administration and some of its allies wanted to go the other direction, expand the economy. So there can be a push and pull, and that can complicate the picture here. It's like running the humidifier and the dehumidifier in the same room. Who knows who will win the battle? So it's difficult to say. It doesn't happen frequently, but it does happen. And also, and this is something that I'm going to elaborate more on next time, and that is sometimes the actions that the Federal Reserve may take may be countered by private members of the public in order to better their own situation, and thereby weakening the position of policy. And we're going to talk about that in something called the rational expectations theory. That's going to be one of the very last things we'll get to next week. But next week is going to be sort of dedicated to theoretical discussions, where we sort of lay out what the state of play is with regard to economic theory in general, and where things stand at the moment, et cetera. And I know that among those theories that's talked about in the book is something called the Taylor rule, which you can read about. I'm pretty sure there was not a question on the exam or quizzes about the Taylor rule, even though it's fairly prominent in macro among those who study monetary policy. I don't talk about it much because it's pretty controversial. The controversy arises not just because of what the rule itself says the Fed should do, when, and why, but because it goes to a sort of broader discussion of having a rule in place that says, if this happens, do this. Instead, discretionary policy has sort of been a watchword for a long time. That is, the Fed does what they think is right at the time that they see it happening. Okay? All right, so questions for me about this. This is very busy, I realize. This is about as crazy as it gets in terms of the graphing here. This itself is not necessarily laid out that concretely in the book. And hopefully you've all got this, or at least the good thing is you can pause everything and get a look. If you can see, and I realize some have had some difficulties with seeing this. And I know that even trying, the control plus sign on your, as a keystroke may help, may not help, because, does it get dizzy if you try to zoom in? I'm sorry, we're trying to do the best we can with what we've got under these conditions. Okay. And jump in if you do have any questions. I do want to talk a bit about theory, and I'm going to come back to this. I don't want to talk a lot about it tonight because I want to come back to it, but I do think it's important while we're talking about monetary policy for at least to talk about the fact that there has been a very substantial amount of macro theory dealing with monetary policy, how it should be used, under what circumstance, under what conditions and rules. And so we say that monetary theory in general is a subset of what we'll talk about next time, called the classical school or the neoclassical school, which they're sort of the successors to the classicists. And it was really set up to sort of counter what was really the prevailing macro theory that had been developed during the Great Depression in the 1930s, known as Keynesian economic theory, named for the British economist John Maynard Keynes, who really sort of came up with a lot of this macro theory and policy advice during the Great Depression. And so a lot of macro owes its legacy to Keynes. However, beginning sometime around the 1950s and 60s, Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago was a strong voice in opposition to Keynesian theory, in particular talking about the fact that while Keynes advocated very strong fiscal policy, they argued that fiscal policy was not particularly effective, that it was inherently inflationary, particularly expansionary. And one of the things about Keynesian theory, because it was developed during the Depression, tends to be associated more with expansionary policy. And it is, among its critics, is the idea that yes, you might get an increase in GDP, but you're also going to get an increase in inflation as a result of increasing government spending, cutting taxes, etc. The evidence for that goes to the time in which monetary theory under Friedman was first developed in the 1960s, in which the government was doing a lot of things. And it could be said, and I think most economists are probably okay and agree with this, that that demand, particularly government spending, the G portion of aggregate demand was going this direction to the right, pushing up the price level to the point where aggregate supply couldn't catch up. In other words, the government can do things that it wants to do just because it wants to do them. And as a result, it can pour on aggregate demand, particularly if it has an almost unlimited amount to borrow, a credit card with no limit, in other words. And as a result, it was considered inflationary, and the inflation of the 60s and more importantly, the 70s was thought to have been a reaction to that. And all the new government spending that came about during that period, we saw an expansion of things like the war in Vietnam, the space program, lots of new government agencies, lots of expansion of all kinds of programs, lots of new agencies like the EPA, the FDA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, all of these new entities, which all had the effect of raising government's profile in the economy and bringing prices up. So fiscal policy is thought to be difficult because of its inflationary tendency. And so as a result, control of the money supply was thought to be more important in Friedman's theory. And we're going to talk a bit more, and I think I'll wait till I'll talk about this next time when we talk about something called the quantity theory of money. And I think I probably ought to move this slide around for next time. I'll make a mental note because it goes better in the monetary or the theory piece that I'll get to next week. But this is what he is mostly known for, was this explanation for where inflation comes from. And let's hold off on that for right now. We'll come back to that in a bit. One thing I do want to talk about, it's going to be really sort of the last of these, and that is that we'll talk about here. That's the money multiplier. We talked about this idea of multipliers before, and I'm just about out of space here, where I'm going to go to erase just this part here. We talked about the multiplier. The first multiplier we talked about was the multiplier on consumption. And that was the multiplier, which is simply a factor which takes some change in something and allows it to ripple through the economy. And the multiplier times some change, in this case, in the consumption multiplier, it's the change in aggregate demand equals some change in GDP overall. Okay. And that's the consumption multiplier. And it was equivalent to 1 over the marginal propensity to save. In other words, it's the inverse of the savings rate. Well, now there's a new multiplier we want to talk about, and that is the money multiplier. And the money multiplier says this: if the money supply is either being expanded or contracted, which is what's going on in both cases, an expansion here, a contraction there, then the ultimate effect on beyond the initial change, remember these are short-term moves, is going to be bigger than what the initial change is, up or down, by the way. Remember, multipliers work in both directions. And so the money multiplier is simply this: it's the reciprocal of the reserve ratio, which is the amount not loaned or invested. So the money supply grows by $1 billion, but if the reserve ratio is 10%, remember this is a percentage, then 100 million of that is going to be set aside, can't be loaned or can't be invested. So only 900 million of the 1 billion can be loaned or invested, and in other words, put to work in the economy. And in some ways, I kind of wish we did do chapter 15. I just know that we have historically not had time in the 7-week to do that, but it kind of shows a little bit more about how this whole thing works in terms of one loan leading to another loan, leading to another loan, et cetera, and moving through the economy with monetary expansion or contraction because it goes in both directions. And so as a result of this, if we think about this, let's say we have that rate of 10%, then the multiplier is 10, right? 1 divided by 0.1 is 10. If the rate were to go down, remember we talked about these tools, the rate goes to 5%, then the multiplier goes up to 20. So a change of $1 billion in the money supply results in a net effect of $20 billion with a 5% reserve requirement. And if it were to go the other direction, were to go up to say 20%, then that multiplier would fall to 5. And so what we can simply say is there's an inverse relationship between the reserve ratio and the multiplier. That is, the higher the reserve ratio, the lower the multiplier, the lower the reserve ratio, the higher the multiplier. And so the money multiplier is oftentimes known as small m, not the big M, that we use the big M for money supply and all that, but it's simply this inverse rate relationship here. The reserve ratio goes up, then the multiplier goes down, and the reserve ratio goes down, the multiplier goes up. That's the money multiplier. And again, that looks a lot like the law of demand. And again, it's one of those inverse relationships that we see happening in many places in macroeconomics. Okay, so I think that is really the last thing that we want to talk about. There's a slide that I've got in here that it's probably not as relevant as maybe what it had been in the past. When we talk about recent Fed actions, among those, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the TALF, which was the Term Asset Loan Secured Facility, which those are all elements around the time of the financial crisis. Since then, though, we've had Operation Twist, and the ZIRP is simply a zero interest rate policy, which is still, you can argue that we're still in the ZIRP policy right now of maintaining rates very, very close to zero. Rates are extremely low right now. And if you've got a bank deposit, you will know that rates are extremely low right now. So zero interest rate policies is an effort to push rates to the absolute minimum, particularly in order to engage in expansion, to get the economy moving. I erased the slide, but it was to get GDP going. Quantitative easing is another term for the effort to inject money into the system, primarily through open market operations. And quantitative easing is the term that's used, sort of an academic term that sort of worked its way into the public domain. So you can look at that if you like. And then the Phillips Curve, I don't think I'm going to get to tonight. That may be another one. So that it's probably better we get to that next time anyway. Because I think also in chapter 18, there's discussion of the Laffer curve that I usually intend to talk about in week 7 anyway. So those are ones that I'll get to next time. What I do want to do I guess we've got about 45 minutes, is to talk about some of the content from chapter 18, which deals with changes in which deals with aggregate supply. And I think what's the title of the chapter? Something about, I forget exactly what it, extending the analysis of aggregate supply, which is pretty much, I mean, that's kind of a long-winded explanation for it. But we do want to talk a bit about how we can explain some of these elements of aggregate supply and how we can explain the transition from short to long run, because and I think I mentioned this before, but one of the things that we can do fairly decently in this sort of two-dimensional graphing is to talk about changes that happen in the very short run. But the thing that is missing, and has been missing for a long time, is this element of time, which is difficult to model, except if you just simply keep on going across and across and note how things change. And unfortunately, having gone to graduate school in this discipline, I've had to see graphs that go all the way across the board, and with the old boards that lift up and slide, and they just go on and on and on, which is an attempt to sort of model time. I will not inflict that upon you here, but what I will do is to try to make an explanation for how we get to a transition, at least on the supply side. So I want to start with just a regular PY plane here that we've been seeing now before. And up to this point, I have had an upward sloping supply curve, aggregate supply curve, and we've simply labeled it short run aggregate supply. And we're going to put a little zero subscript by that to note that that's an initial starting position. And we've got some and we'll introduce aggregate demand here in just a minute. So let's say that we've got some condition where we know that we've got some starting condition of equilibrium in the economy, and we'll simply refer to that as P0 and Y0. And we're going to say for right now that that these are equilibrium conditions, and so it's appropriate to put little asterisks by them, which would sort of suggest that we've got an aggregate demand curve cutting in through here. But I'm not going to put those here now, mostly because we're going to see some conditions of disequilibrium, which is going to explain how we get to the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so which is not really a curve at all, it's a vertical expression. So let's talk about this idea of how these things could change in time to how do we get there? So think about this. Let's say the price level is changing. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that business firms, remember, what is the aggregate supply function? It's anybody who supplies anything in the economy, goods and services, if you're a firm, and labor if you're a worker. And if the price of that output is going up, you're going to likely provide more of it. And why wouldn't you? If whatever good is that you're producing is going up in value, you'll produce more of it. If the wage you're paying is a supplier of labor, remember the labor market is a supply side market from the standpoint of the household. So households are both on the demand and supply side of the economy, depending upon whether they're buying output, being on the demand side, or supplying labor, which puts them on the supply side. And by the way, they're supplying labor usually to firms. Even if it's their own firm, it's still supplying labor. So as a result, people are motivated to supply more as a result. Now here's one bit of this. Let's just take labor as one cost among many other costs, but it isn't just labor, it's also providers of materials and sellers of goods in general. So if the prices of goods are going up, then it's believed that what's going on here is the fact that people are going to supply, so firms are going to supply more output. Moreover, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that prices in the economy are going to rise faster than wages. Okay, so I just want to focus on the labor part. Yes, people will supply more labor as the wage goes up, but there is a lag effect. And by the way, isn't that one of the things that we talked about when we talked about inflation back in Chapter 8? And among those, we talked about they had a whole list of things that were the problems with inflation. And one of those was the lag effect, that you had to endure the inflation before you got an increase in compensation, if you got one at all. So there is a lag effect. So business firms are having to take advantage of rising prices. And by the way, why is there a lag effect? I mean, we know that if the prices are going up, it's really not possible in most cases to go to your employer and say, I need an increase in my pay because last month the consumer price index was up 2% in 1 month. That translates to a 24% annualized rate of inflation. So I should at least be compensated 2% for the rise in inflation last month. And your employer is not going to probably honor that because it's not the way wage increases are generally given. And so as a result, there is a lot of evidence that firms will be more than glad to raise the prices of output, even while not raising its wages, at least in the short run. We are talking about the short run here. However, in the long run, what is the theory behind, and it's not just wage inputs, it's all other inputs, but I'm just focusing on wages because it's sort of an easy one to follow along with. So what happens though, as prices do go up, what if you don't get a wage increase? Then what happens is you're going to do what economists call demanding higher wages. And I know that you may have seen this in your book and people may have talked about it before. It's never really clear as to what that means when economists say workers will demand higher wages, because it makes it sound like the term demand higher wages makes it sound like it's very confrontational and that they're going to go on strike if they can. Now, keep in mind, most workers are not unionized and can't go on strike. And government workers oftentimes are very much restricted from going on strike, even if they are unionized. So going on strike is not what we're talking about so much as finding another job. So finding a place that will pay more. And believe me, firms will understand this. When workers start to leave to go elsewhere, it's a way that firms are demanding, or that workers are demanding higher wages. I worked for an employer once that we had lots and lots and lots of turnover, and management didn't really want to acknowledge it until it got to the point where we were spending so much time trying to find new workers that we couldn't do our regular jobs. So we had to generally raise wages. So when that happens, though, and wages do come up, what happens? Well, it's the increased cost of doing business that is what happens. And as a result of this, whenever the cost of doing business goes up, the supply curve is thought to shift to the left. In other words, there's a walking back in this direction. So the aggregate supply curve shifts from ASSR0 to ASSR1. So as a result, you have a walking backwards here, okay? So as a result of this, it's problematic as a result. So there's a leftward shift in the supply. Why? Because now firms have a higher wage, and so they're going to try to supply less output as a result of it. And it isn't just wages, again, it's all inputs as a result, okay? Likewise, what if prices are falling, which is a less common occurrence, but it can happen. We did see a little bit of deflation happen in 2009. It was the first time we'd seen it for some time. If the prices of outputs are falling, once again, if wages are considered to be sticky, remember, we come back to that term that was discussed in chapter 6. I didn't go over it much in class, but the idea of stickiness is simply the idea that things don't really change as much as what you might expect them to. And so as a result, wages and prices don't react very quickly. So prices of outputs are falling, but firms are reluctant to cut wages. Workers are definitely reluctant to accept lower wages. In time, though, lower wages will be the result of a deflationary environment. And as a result, when the cost of doing business goes down, it is believed that the aggregate supply curve will shift then to the right. So now we move back to this direction here, a rightward shift. And so as a result, what have we got going on here? We've got a walking in this direction. And as a result, we can simply say that I used blue on it before. Let me keep the same color scheme here. So if we just simply lined up the dots here, we end up with what going on here? We said that there's a long run adjustment whereby this then becomes the derivation of the long run aggregate supply curve. That in the long run, aggregate supply is thought to be vertical, like forming a 90-degree angle with the equilibrium GDP. And again, we go back to this, something I talked about just as a mathematical principle, that whenever you have in this particular plane, something that's either completely vertical or completely horizontal, it's completely oblivious to whatever it's parallel to. In other words, long run aggregate supply is oblivious to the price level. That firms are going to supply output regardless of what the price level is in the long run. It's going to do it for its own particular reasons over time. And it's going to do it because of cost of production, profitability, all the things that go into business decisions. But one of those business decisions in the long run is not considered to be the price level. In the short run, yes, but in the long run, no. Mostly because why? It's mostly out of firms' control. This is something that we certainly talk about a lot in microeconomics, is the idea that a lot of these things are outside of business firms' control, price that is. And even though we have this idea, and certainly in a lot of classes you might take accounting and finance where there are these pricing decisions, it's not always the case of there being pricing decisions per se, okay? So this is the derivation of the long run aggregate supply curve. It's due to this idea that in the short run, it's made up of a series of short-term adjustments, which by the way, bring the economy back to an equilibrium condition, which in the long run looks something like this. So if this is if all these, and again, just starting with ASSR0 and where we can imagine a demand curve aggregate demand coming in like that. Well, we can imagine that as being short-run equilibrium. What does long-run equilibrium look like? This is long-run equilibrium in the macro economy. Well, it looks something like this, where you've got the same upward sloping supply curve in the short run. And this marker is about dead here. In fact, let's just get ready to earmark that to be pitched. That's dead. So you get aggregate supply in the short run, aggregate demand, aggregate supply in the short run, aggregate supply in the long run, looking at something like that, and aggregate demand coming in at right there. And so you've got an equilibrium GDP and an equilibrium price level. And so that is what long run equilibrium looks like in the macro economy. So, and that is where there's price stability and there's a maximum amount of employment. In fact, it doesn't look like demand is outrunning supply. It doesn't look like supply is outrunning demand. And so then this begs the question, And this will be the last thing I talk about before I get into talking a bit about inflation and some adjustments. And that is this. If in fact the goal of macro policy in general, whether it's fiscal, monetary, both together, whatever, if the goal of policy is to generate maximum employment with maximum price stability, then how do you achieve that? How do you get there? If you have a shift in one of these, it's going to upset the apple cart. If you have a shift in aggregate supply in the short run, maybe you increase GDP, but you can have the effect of maybe bringing the price level down if it's flooding the market with goods. If there's an increase in aggregate demand, you could be forcing the issue, pushing GDP up, but also bringing the price level up. And I don't think anybody has any doubt about the fact that prices can go up. And we're certainly witness to that right now. And how does this, if the goal is growth, then how do we get there? I mean, that's a longer run goal. I mean, if we talk about the goal of macro policy is maximum employment, maximum price stability, well, growth is another one, right? Because think about this. And one thing I think is very interesting is the last interview he gave before he died, President Kennedy talked about the fact that growth is absolutely required in our economy. And he was talking about an economy 60 years ago, but it's equally important today. And that is our population is growing. And that even if we stood still and had the same amount of output, we would be losing ground in terms of employment because we have new people coming into the market who want jobs. And if the economy is not growing at all, there's no place for them, right? Unless we've got more people leaving through retirement or death or whatever, or being incarcerated, there's no room for them unless we're growing the economy. As our population grows, we simply have to grow the economy. It's a requirement. But yet we have to do it in a way that creates stable prices. And so he talked about the fact that you have to have at least 4% growth in order to accommodate a rising population. Now, population is not growing as quickly as it was then, but there's no reason that we could say that population is not growing. I mean, if we go back to 40 years ago, 1980, the US population was about 200 million. Today, it's about 330 million. So it's up about, 65% since then. So, and that's just in the last 40 years. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we'll be over 500 million people within all of our lifetimes. That would include me. I think I'm probably the oldest person here. So it'll probably be, let's hope, knock on wood here, keep going to the gym. The idea is that we'll probably have more people. So how do we get there? How do we move this whole thing? How do we move the chains, in other words, to use a football term, without getting inflation where demand doesn't move faster than supply, supply doesn't move faster than demand. And there's a great graph, it's on page 377. And I won't recreate it here because I think that describes everything. And the whole thing is to move it all very carefully. As aggregate demand increases, aggregate supply is able to catch up. As aggregate supply increases, aggregate demand is there to meet it. And I think that this is an important thing for us to know is that to grow the economy, to do it in a way that doesn't result in inflation, we have to create a condition where aggregate demand and aggregate supply in the short run are moving at relatively the same pace. So with an increased aggregate demand comes an increased aggregate supply, demand, supply, demand, supply. So we have a move in this direction with only a very nominal increase in the price level. And that graph at the bottom of 377 shows just one iteration of that change, a rise in GDP with only a modest rise in the price level. And again, we go back to this idea that a little bit of inflation is considered to be a good thing. It's considered to be acceptable. It's like the idea of going 70 to 65. It's a little bit more efficient without causing an undue amount of stress and strain. Okay? So questions about that before we go on here. So I've got about 30 minutes remaining. And so I think that that's going to give me enough time to talk about a couple more things that have to do with iterations on aggregate supply in the long run and what they may look like, what this could entail. Okay, so let's talk about in particular inflation, because I think it's important to talk about it. I know that I'm going to go ahead and erase this. Hopefully everyone has got that. And there's a graph, separate graph in the book on this as well. So I want to talk a bit about inflation, a little bit less about recession and a bit more about inflation, because I've been talking about now for several class sessions. And I think it's important for us to get into some of the graphing on this, just to sometimes graphing can show things in a little bit easier way than what non-graphs or certainly that equations can do. So I want to take a little bit of a look at demand pull inflation and what this might look like, and what some of the implications are of it. And I don't think we need any more discussion about is it good, is it bad, etc. I think that we have made the case that that inflation is considered to be problematic, but it is what it is. It doesn't exist. So let's create a condition where we have a short-run aggregate supply curve. We'll have an 80-0 and a short-run aggregate supply curve looking something like that, and a long-run aggregate supply curve looking like that. Short-run aggregate supply looking like that. Okay. So then this gives us then an equilibrium condition of equilibrium GDP Y0. Oops. Need more hands here. So Y0, which corresponds to AD0, AS, short run aggregate supply 0. It's an equilibrium condition, so we'll asterisk there, we'll star as appropriate. P0, price level, and as a result, this is a starting point. This is just that last graph that I put up there, okay? But it's a starting point, and it's one that's going to allow us to explain demand pull inflation. Now, let me give a bit of a re-explanation of this, because I don't think we talked all that much about demand pull inflation, but we noted back in chapter 8 that there were two main kinds of inflation. And basically, well, let's redefine inflation, okay? And that was too many goods chasing too few goods. Too much money chasing too few goods, right? That's sort of a colloquial way of talking about it, but we say it's a general increase in the price level. Remember, P in the macro model is the price level based on some price index, CPI, GDP deflator, one of those indices. And it's too many goods chasing, or too much money chasing too few goods. Demand pull inflation and cost push inflation both, which we'll talk about here in just a second, really fit the bill in both cases. You could say that the too much money is really a demand pull, and too few goods could be the cost push element, which I'll get to here in a second. So what about demand pull inflation? What might be happening here? First of all, there's nothing that's too complicated about a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve that could come about through all kinds of different reasons. It could be a cut in taxes. It could be an increase in government spending. It could be due to things like war, in other words, right? That kind of thing could come about. And as a result, in fact, we talked about the idea that warfare can sometimes be inflationary. In fact, it oftentimes is. It's government spending that is for non-economic purposes primarily, I think you could say. So as a result, we've got an increase in GDP. But at the same time, we have an increase in GDP. We have an increase in the price level. So P0 goes to P1. And so the rightward shift in aggregate demand, which is due to whatever, it could be government spending. I know I bring up government here as sort of a culprit. And I hate to sort of implicate government and say that all inflation is government's fault. But a lot of the arguments against government spending is that it does create demand pull inflation, that the demand side is responsible for it, and that the responsible party tends to be government as a result. So if you believe that there's a reversion back to the long run aggregate supply curve, then what are we saying here? Remember, what is happening with this is the price level is being walked up, right? Yes, there's an increase in GDP as a result of this, but here's the problem with this particular thing, and it has to do once again with the lack of price stickiness, or at least downside inflexibility, and that is the idea of this. Yes, the price level is going up, but as the price level goes up, eventually all input is going to go up, and so as a result, this aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the left, just based upon the same rationale we talked about before. And so as a result, aggregate supply is going to now shift from aggregate supply 0 to ASSR1. And gosh, I don't remember which room here, so ASSR1. And what do we have here? So we've got a restriction in supply as a result of the rise in price. So by the way, this is not all that unusual or unexpected based on another set of criteria. And that is the idea that firms would be reluctant to supply additional output in an inflationary environment because they don't know a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, what the price of its output is going to be. And so why make the commitment to supply things for a long period of time if you don't know what the price of that output is going to be? In particular, why invest in long-term facilities and whatnot if, in fact, you can't judge the price of output? It's a difficult proposition. But as a result, one thing we do know is it's extra inflationary. So the price level, which has started out at P0, has gone to P1 and has now gone to P2. And what has happened with GDP? We've gone back the other direction. And so as a result, this is among those who feel the demand pull inflation is particularly problematic, is the idea that you get the worst of both worlds. You don't get any real increase in GDP. Remember, Y is being defined as real GDP. All you're getting is an increase in the price level with no change in GDP whatsoever. The only increase that you're getting is the little sugar rush that results in an increase in GDP in the short run. But in the long run, aggregate supply is unwilling to catch up. And so as a result, aggregate supply goes on strike. And so now you have, it's a supply side strike. And so you get a reduction in aggregate supply. Okay, so that is part of the logic of this. This was discussed in your book, although I don't know how clear that exposition is in the textbook, but this is really what is happening and what some of the problematic issues are with demand pull inflation, which is oftentimes thought to be, oftentimes due to this issue of government spending. In other words, change in G, right, to the increase. In other words, the change in G is inflationary. So for those who have been concerned about the government's increased spending, and I know a number of you, in our most recent discussion, particularly when we talked about this idea of a balanced budget, talked about this idea of where does it end when the government spends and spends and spends. And now, we have a new presidential administration wanting to spend trillions of dollars more on new stuff. And will it be inflationary, particularly given the fact that some inflation doesn't even appear to be of this variety just yet. This is probably the most conventional view of inflation that we have, that most inflationary periods in our history could be likened to being the demand pull variety. A much less common form of inflation is that which is called cost push. Now, why it's called cost push and not supply push is anyone's guess, but it's really got to do more with the cost of production. There is a variation on cost push inflation, which is known as wage push inflation, which I don't necessarily like so much because it's sort of, it's sort of putting the burden on workers alone when it isn't just workers, because there's a lot of evidence and a lot of suppliers would like higher amounts of compensation. It isn't just workers. And so I think workers tend to act rationally, and if prices of goods are going up, I think they are right to demand higher wages. However, they're able to get them, whether it's walking into the boss's office and saying, I need a raise, or take another job elsewhere, and thereby hoping that the bosses get the message that it's time to raise wages. And by the way, I know a lot of employers are reluctant to do that. I am well aware of it. I've worked for firms that are extremely reluctant to raise wages, and will do so only when they feel like they have no choice. By the way, I think that, and I don't know if we talked about this in our discussions, but about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, I forget what it was, a couple years, I guess, Walmart raised the minimum wage. Walmart's the largest private employer in the country at the moment. The federal government employs more, but that's a lot of different agencies and different places. Walmart's the largest employer. They raised the minimum wage for their workers. I forget what it is. And it was, greeted with some, enthusiasm by the press and whatnot. I think a lot of economists believed, however, the reason they were doing it is because they had sky-high turnover. And this is even prior to the pandemic, that Walmart had to do it because they had to do it. Now, Walmart does not have the reputation of being a particularly generous company when it comes to things like spending money, particularly on employees. And in fact, it's got a pretty shaky record when it tends to deal with employees in general. And I'm not here to slam Walmart. I'm simply using Walmart as an example of a firm that probably got to this wage increase reluctantly and only did it because they probably felt like they had to in order to stem the turnover. And turnover is very damaging to a company. You have to retrain people, new people all the time. And gosh, there are some, I get coffee at a gas station on my way here every now and then. It seems like every time I I go in, there's somebody new there, who, I've never seen before, and it's like, and I realize that we have a robust labor market, but it's like, man, what turnover, and I'm there fairly frequently. So let's talk about this case of cost push inflation. So if demand pull inflation is the most common and the one that we can mostly associate with inflation, generally in most cases, well, then cost push is more of I guess a special case, and one that doesn't happen as much. And in fact, for those who think that it's wrong to view inflation as a wage push inflation, that is, it's workers' fault. I think that there's even less support for that particular idea, just because of the fact that it tends to happen less. So what is the dynamic here with this? And let's go ahead and create a long run aggregate supply curve, which should be straighter than what I drew here. So aggregate supply in the long run, and we've got some initial condition of GDP, which we'll simply call Y0. It's an equilibrium GDP, so it's appropriate to put the little stars, asterisks, that we simply pronounce P star, Q star, or Y star. Okay, so what's happening with this? Now, why this is maybe more indicative of where things are at the moment, which is not so much this, even though a lot of people have been concerned for a long time, particularly with the amount of government spending that our government's been doing, particularly with the new budget and the new infrastructure and all that. And I know President Biden's got a very ambitious agenda for some of this, some of which is probably not going to happen. And a lot of people were concerned that would be inflationary from a demand pull standpoint. But what it does seem like we're seeing at the moment is this, that there's a shrinkage of the supply side. And as a result, aggregate supply shifting to the left, for whatever reason, is thought to be responsible for cost push inflation. And furthermore, what's bad about cost push inflation is you get all the inflation, but you don't get the benefit of, as you do here, even with you don't even get the benefit of a temporary rise in GDP. In fact, you get a decline in GDP. Now, what could this shift to the left in aggregate supply be due to? Well, it could be due to a lot of things. And I do talk about this idea of these extreme events like war and famine and disease and whatnot. And oftentimes when I talk about them, I think that probably there's a tendency for people to think, oh, well, these really one-off events, it must mean inflation's a one-off event. Well, it could be, and we certainly saw war could be responsible for demand pull inflation. It could also be responsible for cost push inflation, or both, because it's a reduction, because it does result in a reduction in supply, if for no other reason than you have a reduction in supply due to a reduction in the labor force because of what war does to the human population. So very often, whenever there's a war going on in the world, there's a certain amount of cost push inflation, a reduction in the willingness and ability to supply output, and that output that does get supplied goes at higher prices. Notice no change is being modeled here as to demand. And I know that in your book, there's a graph that talks about what the response might be on the part of the government. If the government tries to step in and increase aggregate demand, then we go back to this model where we have this kind of thing going on, where we may get back to the original GDP, but we get ever more higher amounts of inflation. Well, that could happen. In fact, that could happen with some of the stimulus that we're seeing happening now on the fiscal side through this new infrastructure bill, which is more than just infrastructure. I know the president's talked about things like expanding daycare, free community college, which does not appear like that's going to happen. And in fact, it's been a little bit of a while since I've looked at where that is at the moment. I think some of it did get passed successfully, and so we'll have some new, and I think there's a lot of people who believe, right, left, and center, that we do need some increased spending on infrastructure. The question is whether the inflation we're seeing right now is of the cost push variety, and that that we don't get the decrease, in GDP as a result. Right now, we haven't seen the decrease in GDP with the rise in the price level, and we'll have to see. So right now, where we are is this temporary condition. Where are we going to see a shifting backward in the aggregate supply curve in the long run, which is indicative of a longer term condition of recession. Right now, it's not particularly clear that we are there yet, but we will see what happens. And so whether inflation is transitory, who knows? But we've certainly seen supply problems happen, no question about it. And I know that one of the discussion questions that I had given the class was this idea of which is more important for government to focus on, aggregate demand or aggregate supply? And it's kind and I will say this, it's a bit of a trick question. It's not intended to be to trip anybody up because there's no right answer or wrong answer. It's simply the question is, should the government be more concerned with supporting the demand side of the economy or the supply side of the economy? In other words, ordinary households typically is what we're talking about, or business firms. And I think that it is a political and ideological question, but it's a good question. And it really goes to the heart of where we're going to be getting to next time when we talk about economic theory. Okay. So there is one more thing. I guess I will talk a bit about the Phillips curve now, because it looks like I guess we're going to have a little bit more time than what we did have. And again, I know that we have a tendency to lose people from time to time. And I don't know what the heck I did with my my slide package here. I think it kind of went poof on me. Let me see. My computer's got frozen. So let's talk about the Phillips curve. I was going to sort of lump that in with next week's discussion, but it is discussed in chapter 18, by the way. And in fact, I'm only going to get really more into the short run elements of Phillips, and the long run is a little bit more controversial. And by the way, it's the long run which sort of has weakened the idea of the Phillips curve as a model. But it's important to talk about because it really does explain a lot and about how the macroeconomy works. So what is the Phillips curve all about? It's one of the first of the theoretical models that we've talked about. I said next time I'll talk about the quantity theory of money. Next time I'll talk about the Laffer curve. Next time I'll talk about the schools of economic thought. But this does tie in, and which is why I suspect the authors included in chapter 18. What is Phillips trying to do with this description? Well, first of all, if you think about it, William Phillips was an interesting character who was primarily, he was an Australian economist who spent most of his time in Britain. And we did a lot of research in the 1950s, 40s and 50s, and talked about the study between inflation and unemployment and what was the trade-off. And it doesn't matter what axes you put these on, whether you put inflation on this axis or on the vertical axis or the horizontal axis, it doesn't matter. Inflation is expressed as a percentage, and unemployment is expressed as a percentage. And by the way, this is just something that occurred to me to mention, but I know that in some of the discussions in another section, we were talking about unemployment, and we get a lot of people talking about unemployment as unemployment benefits. Because I think when people hear the term unemployment, some people think of unemployment as being unemployment benefits. And we're talking about unemployment as the reality of labor force unemployment primarily. Even though economists actually say it's all inputs that are underemployed. We're not talking about benefits, we're talking about the reality. So you got one percentage being plotted against another percentage. And so Phillips said, what's the relationship? And so he took a study and basically arrived connecting the dots. You had some outlying data. But you end up with something like this. So there's an inverse relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate, which makes sense if you think about what's going on here. If in fact you've got something like this, let's say you've got a fairly high inflation rate, and let's say the inflation rate is 10%, which I think a lot of people would believe is an excessively high inflation rate, and you've got an unemployment rate which is low to match it. Let's say it's about 3%. This may not be drawn completely to scale, but it doesn't make any difference. We're simply trying to illustrate the point here. So if the inflation rate is high, what is generally the government's response to a high inflation rate? To slow the economy down. By slowing the economy down, you can do things like raise taxes, cut government spending. On the monetary policy side, the Federal Reserve can raise interest rates, sell bonds in the market. In other words, to bring the rate of inflation down to something more manageable, like 5%, let's say. But in so doing, it slows the economy down and raises the unemployment rate to, say, 8%. So as a result, we have an inverse relationship. This is really the dilemma that Phillips talked about when he did his first study, which is why this is called the Phillips curve. And I think the data sort of points to, once again, like a lot of things in macro, something more curvy than linear. But you get the idea that it's that you can deal with inflation only at the expense of getting more unemployment, and the same works in the other direction as well. You can simply reverse this and say, okay, we've got high unemployment, so we can speed up the economy by cutting taxes, raising government spending. The Fed can lower interest rates. And so doing, we can speed the economy up, bringing the unemployment rate down, but we get inflation as part of the bargain. So this is one of these deals where what is the happy medium that policymakers should strive toward? And it really points out a dilemma that if you try to do one thing, you lift off the gas in one area and you hit the brakes in another area. And so it's this sort of balancing act that has long been thought to be the problem. And this is the dilemma that Phillips really brought up, was this idea of the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And so, in working to solve both of those problems. Here's the problem with Phillips. Now, Phillips is probably on his way to a Nobel Prize in economics until his untimely death due to his being a chain smoker, which is one cause of early death is chain smoking. And that has had to do with the fact that the Phillips curve over time began to do this. It began to shift to the right. Meaning what? Meaning that as the inflation rate went up, and so did the unemployment rate. So as the Phillips curve began shifting to the right, we got more of inflation and more of unemployment. In other words, it's a violation of the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve tells us that we get more of one thing, at least we get the benefit of reducing something else. If inflation and unemployment are the two big problems, yes, we might get rid of one thing, but at the expense of some other thing, at least we get one or the other, and so we can benefit. Here, we're getting both things, and they're both bad things. It'd be one thing if the curve went this direction, we had low inflation and low unemployment, but by the 1970s, we had this condition where the curve was moving this direction, and a new term was coined called stagflation. Stagflation means stagnant economy, in other words, high unemployment with an inflationary condition. So stagflation was the rule. And so by the early 1980s, this was such a problem, and the Phillips curve was deemed to be so problematic that I can recall very clearly as a young undergraduate econ student, one of my professors had posted something on her door detailing this problem and saying, what good are economists who didn't see this happening? Now, since that time, and by the way, since that time, both inflation and unemployment have come down. And so, which tells us that this is only a short run relationship, which is why the long run Phillips curve is more of a vertical expression, meaning that it doesn't really respond to inflation in the long run. Unemployment's more a factor of economic growth. There's a lot of other theory that ties into that, saying that growth is due to other things, not just simply the supply of money and the interest rate and taxation and all that. It has to do with things like institutions and productivity and all that, some of which we'll get into next time. But stagflation was such a problem that it was the case in which textbook publishers were saying, we're not going to publish any new editions of macro until you guys have figured this out. That was how big of a deal stagflation was in the early 80s. And so as a result, Phillips looked pretty good until stagflation set in the early 80s. And it was only arrested by dealing with this thing first. And what happened was the Federal Reserve hit the brakes hard and brought the inflation rate down. And in fact, in that very short time period, unemployment went zooming. And so as a result, you saw the inflation rate come down. In other words, a return more toward normality, which the curve demonstrates this trade-off. But the unemployment rate skyrocketed to double digits. And the part of the country I was living in at the time, the upper Midwest, big manufacturing area. And what do manufacturers do? Make normal goods, primarily durable goods in particular, like cars and electronics. Unemployment was as high as 20–25% in some areas. So mostly because of the effort to deal with inflation first, unemployment second. And by the way, this is a good segue to where we're going next time when we talk about which of these are the priorities. Is dealing with inflation a bigger priority than dealing with unemployment? And this really sets the stage for what are the major distinguishing factors between the two schools of economic thought that have sort of arisen over time that have to do a lot with, is inflation a bigger problem? The classicists would say inflation is a bigger problem than unemployment. The Keynesians would say unemployment's a bigger problem than inflation. So these are pretty divergent worldviews of economics, but that's really where we're heading, and we're going to get into that next time when we come back. And so we're pretty much done with what we needed to talk about tonight. Are there any questions that I can answer for anybody? The handful of you are here tonight. Okay, well, I'm gonna, if so, feel free to get with me again. I'll be working assiduously through the weekend to try to sort through and make all these grades visible. If you don't see any meaningful change to something you think should be there, get with me. I'll get with you as quickly as I can, but there are, this is a time of year when it does get a little bit busy for everybody in the academic setting, and I will do my best, but I promise you that you will get the grade that you do deserve, and that these technical issues will get overcome, at least in the end result. Okay. So anyway, feel free to get with me. In the meantime, have a great weekend, and I will see you all next time.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.